Chapter 11. Ram Das. There were fine sunsets even in the square sometimes. One could only see parts of them, however, between the chimneys and over the roofs. From the kitchen windows one could not see them at all, and could only guess that they were going on because the bricks looked warm and the air rosy or yellow for a while, or perhaps one saw a blazing glow strike a particular pane of glass somewhere. There was, however, one place from which one could see all the splendour of them, the piles of red or gold clouds in the west, or the purple ones edged with dazzling brightness, or the little fleecy floating ones tinged with rose colour and looking like flights of pink doves scurrying across the blue in a great hurry if there was a wind. The place where one could see all this, and seem at the same time to breathe a purer air, was, of course, the attic window. When the square suddenly seemed to begin to glow in an enchanted way and look wonderful in spite of its sooty trees and railings, Sarah knew something was going on in the sky, and when it was at all possible to leave the kitchen without being missed or called back, she invariably stole away and crept up the flights of stairs, and climbing on the old table, got her head and body as far out of the window as possible. When she had accomplished this, she always drew a long breath and looked all round her. It used to seem as if she had all the sky and the world to herself. No one else ever looked out of the other attics. Generally the skylights were closed, but even if they were propped open to admit air, no one seemed to come near them. And there Sarah would stand, sometimes turning her face upward to the blue, which seemed so friendly and near, just like a lovely vaulted ceiling, sometimes watching the west and all the wonderful things that happened there, the clouds melting or drifting or waiting softly to be changed pink or crimson or snow-white or purple or pale dove-grey. Sometimes they made islands or great mountains enclosing lakes of deep turquoise blue or liquid amber or chrysoprase green. Sometimes dark headlands jutted into strange lost seas. Sometimes slender strips of wonderful lands joined other wonderful lands together. There were places where it seemed that one could run or climb or stand and wait to see what was next coming, until perhaps, as it melted, one could float away. At least it seemed so to Sarah, and nothing had ever been quite so beautiful to her as the things she saw as she stood on the table, her body half out of the skylight, the sparrows twittering with sunset softness on the slates. The sparrows always seemed to her to twitter with a sort of subdued softness just when these marvels were going on. There was such a sunset as this a few days after the Indian gentleman was brought to his new home, and, as it fortunately happened that the afternoon's work was done in the kitchen and nobody had ordered her to go anywhere or perform any task, Sarah found it easier than usual to slip away and go upstairs. She mounted her table and stood looking out. It was a wonderful moment. There were floods of molten gold covering the west, as if a glorious tide was sweeping over the world. A deep, rich yellow light filled the air. The birds flying across the tops of the houses showed quite black against it. "It's a splendid one," said Sarah softly to herself. "It makes me feel almost afraid, as if something strange was just going to happen. The splendid ones always make me feel like that." She suddenly turned her head because she heard a sound a few yards away from her. It was an odd sound, like a queer little squeaky chattering. It came from the window of the next attic. Someone had come to look at the sunset as she had. There was a head and a part of a body emerging from the skylight, but it was not the head or body of a little girl or a housemaid. It was the picturesque white-swathed form and dark-faced, gleaming-eyed, white-turbaned head of a native Indian manservant. "Alaska," Sarah said to herself quickly, and the sound she heard came from a small monkey he held in his arms as if he were fond of it, and which was snuggling and chattering against his breast. As Sarah looked toward him, he looked toward her. The first thing she thought was that his dark face looked sorrowful and homesick. She felt absolutely sure he had come up to look at the sun, because he had seen it so seldom in England that he longed for a sight of it. She looked at him interestedly for a second, and then smiled across the slates. She had learned to know how comforting a smile, even from a stranger, may be. Hers was evidently a pleasure to him. His whole expression altered, and he showed such gleaming white teeth as he smiled back that it was as if a light had been illuminated in his dusky face. The friendly look in Sarah's eyes was always very effective when people felt tired or dull. It was perhaps in making his salute to her that he loosened his hold on the monkey. He was an impish monkey, and always ready for adventure, and it is probable that the sight of a little girl excited him. He suddenly broke loose, jumped onto the slates, ran across them chattering, and actually leaped on to Sarah's shoulder, and from there down into her attic room. It made her laugh and delighted her, but she knew he must be restored to his master, if the Lascar was his master, and she wondered how this was to be done. Would he let her catch him, or would he be naughty and refuse to be caught, and perhaps get away and run off over the roofs and be lost? That would not do at all. Perhaps he belonged to the Indian gentleman, and the poor man was fond of him. She turned to the Lascar, feeling glad that she remembered still some of the Hindustani she had learned when she lived with her father. She could make the man understand. She spoke to him in the language he knew. "Will he let me catch him?" she asked. She thought she had never seen more surprise and delight than the dark face expressed when she spoke in the familiar tongue. The truth was that the poor fellow felt as if his gods had intervened, and the kind little voice came from heaven itself. At once Sarah saw that he had been accustomed to European children. He poured forth a flood of respectful thanks. He was the servant of Missy Sahib. The monkey was a good monkey and would not bite, but unfortunately he was difficult to catch. He would flee from one spot to another like the lightning. He was disobedient, though not evil. Ram Das knew him as if he were his child, and Ram Das he would sometimes obey, but not always. If Missy Sahib would permit Ram Das, he himself could cross the roof to her room, enter the windows, and regain the unworthy little animal. But he was evidently afraid Sarah might think he was taking a great liberty, and perhaps would not let him come. But Sarah gave him leave at once. "Can you get across?" she inquired. "In a moment," he answered her. "Then come," she said. "He is flying from side to side of the room as if he was frightened." Ram Das slipped through his attic window and crossed to hers as steadily and lightly as if he had walked on roofs all his life. He slipped through the skylight and dropped upon his feet without a sound. Then he turned to Sarah and salaamed again. The monkey saw him and uttered a little scream. Ram Das hastily took the precaution of shutting the skylight, and then went in chase of him. It was not a very long chase. The monkey prolonged it a few minutes, evidently for the mere fun of it, but presently he sprang chattering on to Ram Das's shoulder, and sat there chattering and clinging to his neck with a weird little skinny arm. Ram Das thanked Sarah profoundly. She had seen that his quick native eyes had taken in at a glance all the bare shabbiness of the room, but he spoke to her as if he were speaking to the little daughter of a Rajah, and pretended that he observed nothing. He did not presume to remain more than a few moments after he had caught the monkey, and those moments were given to further deep and grateful obeisance to her in return for her indulgence. This little evil one, he said, stroking the monkey, was in truth not so evil as he seemed, and his master, who was ill, was sometimes amused by him. He would have been made sad if his favourite had run away and been lost. Then he salaamed once more, and got through the skylight and across the slates again, with as much agility as the monkey himself had displayed. When he had gone, Sarah stood in the middle of her attic, and thought of many things his face and manner had brought back to her. The sight of his native costume, and the profound reverence of his manner, stirred all her past memories. It seemed a strange thing to remember that she, the drudge whom the cook had said insulting things to an hour ago, had only a few years ago been surrounded by people who all treated her as Ram Das had treated her, who salaamed when she went by, whose foreheads almost touched the ground when she spoke to them, who were her servants and her slaves. It was like a sort of dream. It was all over, and it could never come back. It certainly seemed that there was no way in which any change could take place. She knew what Miss Minchin intended that her future should be. So long as she was too young to be used as a regular teacher, she would be used as an errand girl and servant, and yet expected to remember what she had learned, and in some mysterious way to learn more. The greater number of her evenings she was supposed to spend at study, and at various indefinite intervals she was examined, and knew she would have been severely admonished if she had not advanced as was expected of her. The truth, indeed, was that Miss Minchin knew that she was too anxious to learn to require teachers. Give her books, and she would devour them and end by knowing them by heart. She might be trusted to be equal to teaching a good deal in the course of a few years. This was what would happen. When she was older, she would be expected to drudge in the schoolroom, as she drudged now in various parts of the house. They would be obliged to give her more respectable clothes, but they would be sure to be plain and ugly, and to make her look somehow like a servant. That was all there seemed to be to look forward to, and Sarah stood quite still for several minutes and thought it over. Then a thought came back to her, which made the colour rise in her cheek and a spark light itself in her eyes. She straightened her thin little body and lifted her head. "Whatever comes," she said, "cannot alter one thing. If I am a princess in rags and tatters, I can be a princess inside. It would be easy to be a princess if I were dressed in cloth of gold. But it is a great deal more of a triumph to be one all the time, when no one knows it. There was Marie Antoinette when she was in prison, and her throne was gone, and she had only a black gown on, and her hair was white, and they insulted her, and called her Widow Capet. She was a great deal more like a queen than they when she was so gay, and everything was so grand. I like her best then. Those howling mobs of people did not frighten her. She was stronger than they were, even when they cut her head off." This was not a new thought, but quite an old one by this time. It had consoled her through many a bitter day, and she had gone about the house with an expression in her face which Miss Minchin could not understand, and which was a source of great annoyance to her, as it seemed as if the child were mentally living a life which held her above the rest of the world. It was as if she scarcely heard the rude and acid things said to her, or, if she heard them, did not care for them at all. Sometimes, when she was in the midst of some harsh, domineering speech, Miss Minchin would find the still, unchildish eyes fixed upon her with something like a proud smile in them. At such times she did not know that Sarah was saying to herself, "You don't know that you are saying these things to a princess, and that if I chose I could wave my hand and order you to execution. I only spare you because I am a princess, and you are a poor, stupid, unkind, vulgar old thing, and don't know any better." This used to interest and amuse her more than anything else, and, queer and fanciful as it was, she found comfort in it, and it was a good thing for her. While the thought held possession of her, she could not be made rude and malicious by the rudeness and malice of those about her. "A princess must be polite," she said to herself. And so, when the servants, taking their tone from their mistress, were insolent and ordered her about, she would hold her head erect and reply to them with a quaint civility which often made them stare at her. "She's got more airs and graces than if she come from Buckingham Palace, that young one," said the cook, chuckling a little sometimes. "I lose my temper with her often enough, but I will say she never forgets her manners. If you please, cook. Will you be so kind, cook? I beg your pardon, cook. May I trouble you, cook?" She drops them about the kitchen as if they was nothing. The morning after the interview with Ram Das and his monkey, Sarah was in the schoolroom with her small pupils. Having finished giving them their lessons, she was putting the French exercise books together, and thinking, as she did it, of the various things royal personages in disguise were called upon to do. Alfred the Great, for instance, burning the cakes and getting his ears boxed by the wife of the neatherd. How frightened she must have been when she found out what she had done. If Miss Minchin should find out that she, Sarah, whose toes were almost sticking out of her boots, was a princess, a real one. The look in her eyes was exactly the look which Miss Minchin most disliked. She would not have it. She was quite near her, and was so enraged that she actually flew at her and boxed her ears, exactly as the neatherd's wife had boxed King Alfred's. It made Sarah start. She wakened from her dream at the shock, and, catching her breath, stood still a second. Then, not knowing she was going to do it, she broke into a little laugh. What are you laughing at, you bold, impudent child?" Miss Minchin exclaimed. It took Sarah a few seconds to control herself sufficiently to remember that she was a princess. Her cheeks were red and smarting from the blows she had received. "I was thinking," she answered. "Beg my pardon immediately," said Miss Minchin. Sarah hesitated a second before she replied. "I will beg your pardon for laughing if it was rude," she said then, "but I won't beg your pardon for thinking." "What were you thinking?" demanded Miss Minchin. "How dare you think? What were you thinking?" Jessie tittered, and she and Lavinia nudged each other in unison. All the girls looked up from their books to listen. Really, it always interested them a little when Miss Minchin attacked Sarah. Sarah always said something queer, and never seemed the least bit frightened. She was not in the least frightened now, though her boxed ears were scarlet and her eyes were as bright as stars. "I was thinking," she answered grandly and politely, "that you did not know what you were doing." "That I did not know what I was doing?" Miss Minchin fairly gasped. "Yes," said Sarah. "And I was thinking what would happen if I were a princess and you boxed my ears, what I should do to you. And I was thinking that if I were one you would never dare to do it, whatever I said or did. And I was thinking how surprised and frightened you would be if you suddenly found out." She had the imagined future so clearly before her eyes that she spoke in a manner which had an effect even upon Miss Minchin. It almost seemed for the moment to her narrow, unimaginative mind that there must be some real power hidden behind this candid daring. "What?" she exclaimed. "Found out what?" "That I really was a princess," said Sarah, "and could do anything I liked." Every pair of eyes in the room widened to its full limit. Lavinia leaned forward on her seat to look. "Go to your room!" cried Miss Minchin breathlessly. "This instant! Leave the schoolroom! Attend your lessons, young ladies!" Sarah made a little bow. "Excuse me for laughing if it was impolite," she said, and walked out of the room, leaving Miss Minchin struggling with her rage, and the girls whispering over their books. "Did you see her? Did you see how queer she looked?" Jessie broke out. "I shouldn't be at all surprised if she did turn out to be something. Suppose she should!" End of chapter 11. Chapter 12. The Other Side of the Wall. When one lives in a row of houses, it is interesting to think of the things which are being done and said on the other side of the wall of the very rooms one is living in. Sarah was fond of amusing herself by trying to imagine the things hidden by the wall which divided the select seminary from the Indian gentleman's house. She knew that the schoolroom was next to the Indian gentleman's study, and she hoped that the wall was thick, so that the noise, made sometimes after lesson hours, would not disturb him. "I am growing quite fond of him," she said to Ermengarde. "I should not like him to be disturbed. I have adopted him for a friend. You can do that with people you never speak to at all. You can just watch them, and think about them, and be sorry for them, until they seem almost like relations. I'm quite anxious sometimes when I see the doctor call twice a day." "I have very few relations," said Ermengarde reflectively, "and I'm very glad of it. I don't like those I have. My two aunts are always saying, 'Dear me, Ermengarde, you are very fat, you shouldn't eat sweets.' And my uncle is always asking me things like, 'When did Edward III ascend the throne?' and 'Who died of a surfeit of lampreys?'" Sarah laughed. "People you never speak to can't ask you questions like that," she said. "And I'm sure the Indian gentleman wouldn't even if he was quite intimate with you. I am fond of him." She had become fond of the large family because they looked happy, but she had become fond of the Indian gentleman because he looked unhappy. He had evidently not fully recovered from some very severe illness. In the kitchen, where of course the servants through some mysterious means knew everything, there was much discussion of his case. He was not an Indian gentleman really, but an Englishman who had lived in India. He had met with great misfortunes, which had for a time so imperilled his whole fortune that he had thought himself ruined and disgraced for ever. The shock had been so great that he had almost died of brain fever, and ever since he had been shattered in health, though his fortunes had changed and all his possessions had been restored to him. His trouble and peril had been connected with mines. "And mines with diamonds in 'em," said the cook. "No savings o' mine never goes into no mines, particular diamond ones," with a side glance at Sarah. "We all know something of them." He felt as my papa felt, Sarah thought. He was ill as my papa was, but he did not die. So her heart was more drawn to him than before. When she was sent out at night, she used sometimes to feel quite glad, because there was always a chance that the curtains of the house next door might not yet be closed, and she could look into the warm room and see her adopted friend. When no one was about she used sometimes to stop, and holding to the iron railings, wish him good night, as if he could hear her. "Perhaps you can feel if you can't hear," was her fancy. "Perhaps kind thoughts reach people somehow, even through windows and doors and walls. Perhaps you feel a little warm and comforted, and don't know why, when I am standing here in the cold and hoping you will get well and happy again. I am so sorry for you," she would whisper in an intense little voice. "I wish you had a little missus who could pet you as I used to pet papa when he had a headache. I should like to be your little missus myself, poor dear. Good night. Good night. God bless you." She would go away, feeling quite comforted and a little warmer herself. Her sympathy was so strong that it seemed as if it must reach him somehow, as he sat alone in his armchair by the fire, nearly always in a great dressing-gown, and nearly always with his forehead resting in his hand as he gazed hopelessly into the fire. He looked to Sarah like a man who had a trouble on his mind still, not merely like one whose troubles lay all in the past. "He always seems as if he were thinking of something that hurts him now," she said to herself. "But he has got his money back, and he will get over his brain fever in time, so he ought not to look like that. I wonder if there is something else." If there was something else, something even servants did not hear of, she could not help believing that the father of the Large family knew it, the gentleman she called Mr. Montmorency. Mr. Montmorency went to see him often, and Mrs. Montmorency and all the little Montmorencys went too, though less often. He seemed particularly fond of the two elder little girls, the Janet and Nora, who had been so alarmed when their small brother Donald had given Sarah his sixpence. He had, in fact, a very tender place in his heart for all children, and particularly for little girls. Janet and Nora were as fond of him as he was of them, and looked forward with the greatest pleasure to the afternoons when they were allowed to cross the square and make their well-behaved little visits to him. They were extremely decorous little visits, because he was an invalid. "He is a poor thing," said Janet, "and he says we cheer him up. We try to cheer him up very quietly." Janet was the head of the family and kept the rest of it in order. It was she who decided when it was discreet to ask the Indian gentleman to tell stories about India, and it was she who saw when he was tired and it was time to steal quietly away and tell Ram Das to go to him. They were very fond of Ram Das. He could have told any number of stories if he had been able to speak anything but Hindustani. The Indian gentleman's real name was Mr. Carrisford, and Janet told Mr. Carrisford about the encounter with the little girl who was not a beggar. He was very much interested, and all the more so when he heard from Ram Das of the adventure of the monkey on the roof. Ram Das made for him a very clear picture of the attic and its desolateness, of the bare floor and broken plaster, the rusty, empty grate, and the hard, narrow bed. "Carmichael," he said to the father of the Large family, after he had heard this description, "I wonder how many of the attics in this square are like that one, and how many wretched little servant girls sleep on such beds, while I toss on my down pillows, loaded and harassed by wealth, that is, most of it, not mine." "My dear fellow," Mr. Carmichael answered cheerily, "the sooner you cease tormenting yourself the better it will be for you. If you possessed all the wealth of all the Indies you could not set right all the discomforts in the world, and if you began to refurnish all the attics in this square there would still remain all the attics in all the other squares and streets to put in order. And there you are." Mr. Carrisford sat and bit his nails as he looked into the glowing bed of coals in the grate. "Do you suppose," he said slowly after a pause, "do you think it is possible that the other child, the child I never cease thinking of, I believe, could possibly be reduced to any such condition as the poor little soul next door?" Mr. Carmichael looked at him uneasily. He knew that the worst thing the man could do for himself, for his reason and his health, was to begin to think in the particular way of this particular subject. "If the child at Madame Pascal's school in Paris was the one you were in search of," he answered soothingly, "she would seem to be in the hands of people who can afford to take care of her. They adopted her because she had been the favourite companion to their little daughter, who died. They had no other children, and Madame Pascal said that they were extremely well-to-do Russians. And the wretched woman actually did not know where they had taken her," exclaimed Mr. Carrisford. Mr. Carmichael shrugged his shoulders. "She was a shrewd, worldly Frenchwoman, and was evidently only too glad to get the child so comfortably off her hands when the father's death left her totally unprovided for. Women of her type do not trouble themselves about the futures of children who might prove burdens. The adopted parents apparently disappeared and left no trace. But you say if the child was the one I am in search of. You say if. We are not sure. There was a difference in the name. Madame Pascal pronounced it as if it were Carew instead of Crewe, but that might merely be a matter of pronunciation. The circumstances were curiously similar. An English officer in India had placed his motherless little girl at the school. He had died suddenly after losing his fortune." Mr. Carmichael paused a moment, as if a new thought had occurred to him. "Are you sure the child was left at a school in Paris? Are you sure it was Paris?" "My dear fellow," broke forth Carrisford with restless bitterness, "I am sure of nothing. I never saw either the child or her mother. Ralph Crewe and I loved each other as boys, but we had not met since our school days, until we met in India. I was absorbed in the magnificent promise of the mines. He became absorbed too. The whole thing was so huge and glittering that we half lost our heads. When we met we scarcely spoke of anything else. I only knew that the child had been sent to school somewhere. I do not even remember now how I knew it." He was beginning to be excited. He always became excited when his still weakened brain was stirred by memories of the catastrophes of the past. Mr. Carmichael watched him anxiously. It was necessary to ask some questions, but they must be put quietly and with caution. "But you had reason to think the school was in Paris?" "Yes," was the answer, "because her mother was a Frenchwoman, and I had heard that she wished her child to be educated in Paris. It seemed only likely that she would be there." "Yes," Mr. Carmichael said, "it seems more than probable." The Indian gentleman leaned forward and struck the table with a long, wasted hand. "Carmichael," he said, "I must find her. If she is alive, she is somewhere. If she is friendless and penniless, it is through my fault. How is a man to get back his nerve with a thing like that on his mind? This sudden change of luck at the mines has made realities of all our most fantastic dreams, and poor Crewe's child may be begging in the street." "No, no," said Carmichael. "Try to be calm. Console yourself with the fact that when she is found you have a fortune to hand over to her." "Why was I not man enough to stand my ground when things look black?" Carrisford groaned in petulant misery. "I believe I should have stood my ground if I had not been responsible for other people's money as well as my own. Poor Crewe had put into the scheme every penny that he owned. He trusted me, he loved me, and he died thinking I had ruined him. I, Tom Carrisford, who played cricket at Eton with him. What a villain he must have thought me." "Don't reproach yourself so bitterly." "I don't reproach myself because the speculation threatened to fail. I reproach myself for losing my courage. I ran away like a swindler and a thief because I could not face my best friend and tell him I had ruined him and his child." The good-hearted father of the large family put his hand on his shoulder comfortingly. "You ran away because your brain had given way under the strain of mental torture," he said. "You were half delirious already. If you had not been you would have stayed and fought it out.
You were in a hospital, strapped down in bed, raving with brain fever 2 days after you left the place. Remember that." Carrisford dropped his forehead in his hands. "Good God! Yes," he said. "I was driven mad with dread and horror. I had not slept for weeks. The night I staggered out of my house all the air seemed full of hideous things mocking and mouthing at me." "That is explanation enough in itself," said Mr. Carmichael. "How could a man on the verge of brain fever judge sanely?" Carrisford shook his drooping head. "And when I returned to consciousness, poor Crewe was dead and buried. And I seemed to remember nothing. I did not remember the child for months and months. Even when I began to recall her existence, everything seemed in a sort of haze." He stopped a moment and rubbed his forehead. "It sometimes seems so now when I try to remember. Surely I must sometime have heard Crewe speak of the school she was sent to. Don't you think so?" "He might not have spoken of it definitely. You never seem even to have heard her real name." "He used to call her by an odd pet name he had invented. He called her his little missus. But the wretched mines drove everything else out of our heads. We talked of nothing else. If he spoke of the school, I forgot. I forgot. And now I shall never remember." "Come, come," said Carmichael. "We shall find her yet. We will continue to search for Madame Pascal's good-natured Russians. She seemed to have a vague idea that they lived in Moscow. I will take that as a clue. I will go to Moscow." "If I were able to travel I would go with you," said Carrisford. "But I can only sit here wrapped in furs and stare at the fire. And when I look into it I seem to see Crewe's gay young face gazing back at me. He looks as if he were asking me a question. Sometimes I dream of him at night, and he always stands before me and asks the same question in words. Can you guess what he says, Carmichael?" Mr. Carmichael answered him in a rather low voice. "Not exactly," he said. "He always says, 'Tom, old man, Tom, where is the little missus?'" He caught at Carmichael's hand and clung to it. "I must be able to answer him. I must," he said. "Help me to find her. Help me." On the other side of the wall, Sarah was sitting in her garret talking to Melchizedek, who had come out for his evening meal. "It has been hard to be a princess today, Melchizedek," she said. "It has been harder than usual. It gets harder as the weather grows colder and the streets get more sloppy. When Lavinia laughed at my muddy skirt as I passed her in the hall, I thought of something to say all in a flash, and I only just stopped myself in time. You can't sneer back at people like that, if you are a princess, but you have to bite your tongue to hold yourself in. I bit mine. It was a cold afternoon, Melchizedek, and it's a cold night." Quite suddenly she put her black head down in her arms, as she often did when she was alone. "Oh, Papa," she whispered, "what a long time it seems since I was your little missus." This was what happened that day on both sides of the wall. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13. One of the Populace. The winter was a wretched one. There were days on which Sarah tramped through snow when she went on her errands. There were worse days when the snow melted and combined itself with mud to form slush. There were others when the fog was so thick that the lamps in the street were lighted all day, and London looked as it had looked the afternoon, several years ago, when the cab had driven through the thoroughfares with Sarah tucked up on its seat, leaning against her father's shoulder. On such days the windows of the house of the large family always looked delightfully cosy and alluring, and the study in which the Indian gentleman sat glowed with warmth and rich colour. But the attic was dismal beyond words. There were no longer sunsets or sunrises to look at, and scarcely ever any stars, it seemed to Sarah. The clouds hung low over the skylight, and were either grey or mud colour, or dropping heavy rain. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, even when there was no special fog, the daylight was at an end. If it was necessary to go to her attic for anything, Sarah was obliged to light a candle. The women in the kitchen were depressed, and that made them more ill-tempered than ever. Becky was driven like a little slave. "'Tweren't for you, miss," she said hoarsely to Sarah one night when she had crept into the attic. "'Tweren't for you, and the Bastille, and being the prisoner in the next cell. I should die. That there does seem real now, doesn't it? The missus is more like the head jailer every day she lives. I can just see them big keys you say she carries. The cook, she's like one of the under jailers. Tell me some more, please, miss. Tell me about the subterranean passage we've dug under the walls." "I'll tell you something warmer," shivered Sarah. "Get your coverlet and wrap it round you, and I'll get mine, and we will huddle close together on the bed, and I'll tell you about the tropical forest where the Indian gentleman's monkey used to live. When I see him sitting on the table near the window and looking out into the street with that mournful expression, I always feel sure he is thinking about the tropical forest where he used to swing by his tail from coconut trees. I wonder who caught him, and if he left a family behind who had depended on him for coconuts." "That is warmer, miss," said Becky gratefully. "But some days even the Bastille is sort of eaten when he gets to telling about it." "That is because it makes you think of something else," said Sarah, wrapping the coverlet round her until only her small dark face was to be seen looking out of it. "I've noticed this. What you have to do with your mind when your body is miserable is to make it think of something else." "Can you do it, miss?" faltered Becky, regarding her with admiring eyes. Sarah knitted her brows a moment. "Sometimes I can, and sometimes I can't," she said stoutly. "But when I can, I'm all right. And what I believe is that we always could, if we practised enough. I've been practising a good deal lately, and it's beginning to be easier than it used to be. When things are horrible, just horrible, I think as hard as ever I can of being a princess. I say to myself, I am a princess, and I am a fairy one, and because I am a fairy nothing can hurt me or make me uncomfortable. You don't know how it makes you forget," with a laugh. She had many opportunities of making her mind think of something else, and many opportunities of proving to herself whether or not she was a princess. But one of the strongest tests she was ever put to came on a certain dreadful day, which, she often thought afterward, would never quite fade out of her memory, even in the years to come. For several days it had rained continuously. The streets were chilly and sloppy and full of dreary cold mist. There was mud everywhere, sticky London mud, and over everything the pall of drizzle and fog. Of course there were several long and tiresome errands to be done. There always were on days like this, and Sarah was sent out again and again, until her shabby clothes were damp through. The absurd old feathers on her forlorn hat were more draggled and absurd than ever, and her downtrodden shoes were so wet that they could not hold any more water. Added to this, she had been deprived of her dinner because Miss Minchin had chosen to punish her. She was so cold and hungry and tired that her face began to have a pinched look, and now and then some kind-hearted person passing her in the street glanced at her with sudden sympathy. But she did not know that. She hurried on, trying to make her mind think of something else. It was really very necessary. Her way of doing it was to pretend and suppose with all the strength that was left in her. But really this time it was harder than she had ever found it, and once or twice she thought it almost made her more cold and hungry instead of less so. But she persevered obstinately, and as the muddy water squelched through her broken shoes, and the wind seemed trying to drag her thin jacket from her, she talked to herself as she walked, though she did not speak aloud or even move her lips. "Suppose I had dry clothes on," she thought. "Suppose I had good shoes, and a long thick coat, and merino stockings, and a whole umbrella. And suppose, just when I was near a baker's where they sold hot buns, I should find sixpence, which belonged to nobody. Suppose, if I did, I should go into the shop and buy 6 of the hottest buns and eat them all without stopping. Some very odd things happen in this world sometimes. It certainly was an odd thing that happened to Sarah. She had to cross the street just when she was saying this to herself. The mud was dreadful. She almost had to wade. She picked her way as carefully as she could, but she could not save herself much. Only in picking her way she had to look down at her feet and the mud, and in looking down, just as she reached the pavement, she saw something shining in the gutter. It was actually a piece of silver, a tiny piece trodden upon by many feet, but still with spirit enough left to shine a little. Not quite a 6pence, but the next thing to it, a 4-penny piece. In 1 second it was in her cold little red and blue hand. "Oh!" she gasped. "It is true! It is true!" And then, if you will believe me, she looked straight at the shop directly facing her. And it was a baker's shop, and a cheerful, stout, motherly woman with rosy cheeks was putting into the window a tray of deliciously newly baked hot buns, fresh from the oven, large, plump, shiny buns, with currants in them. It almost made Sarah feel faint for a few seconds. The shock, and the sight of the buns, and the delightful odours of warm bread floating up through the baker's cellar window. She knew she need not hesitate to use the little piece of money. It had evidently been lying in the mud for some time, and its owner was completely lost in the stream of passing people who crowded and jostled each other all day long. "But I'll go and ask the baker woman if she has lost anything," she said to herself, rather faintly. So she crossed the pavement and put her wet foot on the step. As she did so, she saw something that made her stop. It was a little figure, more forlorn even than herself, a little figure which was not much more than a bundle of rags, from which small, bare, red, muddy feet peeped out, only because the rags with which their owner was trying to cover them were not long enough. Above the rags appeared a shock-head of tangled hair, and a dirty face with big, hollow, hungry eyes. Sarah knew they were hungry eyes the moment she saw them, and she felt a sudden sympathy. "This," she said to herself with a little sigh, "is one of the populace, and she is hungrier than I am." The child, this one of the populace, stared up at Sarah, and shuffled herself aside a little, so as to give her room to pass. She was used to being made to give room to everybody. She knew that if a policeman chanced to see her, he would tell her to move on. Sarah clutched her little 4-penny piece and hesitated for a few seconds. Then she spoke to her. "Are you hungry?" she said. The child shuffled herself and her rags a little more. "Ain't I just?" she said in a hoarse voice. "Just ain't I?" "Haven't you had any dinner?" said Sarah. "No dinner," more hoarsely still, and with more shuffling. "Nor yet no breakfast, nor yet no supper, no nothing." "Since when?" asked Sarah. "Dunno. Never got nothing to-day, nowhere. I've axed and axed." Just to look at her made Sarah more hungry and faint. But those queer little thoughts were at work in her brain, and she was talking to herself, though she was sick at heart. "If I'm a princess," she was saying, "if I'm a princess, when they were poor and driven from their thrones, they always shared with the populace if they met one poorer and hungrier than themselves. They always shared. Buns are a penny each. If it had been 6pence I could have eaten 6. It won't be enough for either of us, but it will be better than nothing." "Wait a minute," she said to the beggar child. She went into the shop. It was warm and smelled deliciously. The woman was just going to put more hot buns into the window. "If you please," said Sarah, "have you lost 4pence, a silver 4pence?" And she held the forlorn little piece of money out to her. The woman looked at it, and then at her intense little face and draggled, once fine clothes. "Bless us, no!" she answered. "Did you find it?" "Yes," said Sarah, "in the gutter." "Keep it then," said the woman. It may have been there for a week, and goodness knows who lost it. You could never find out."
"I know that," said Sarah, "but I thought I would ask you."
"Not many would," said the woman, looking puzzled and interested and good-natured all at once. "Do you want to buy something?" she added, as she saw Sarah glance at the buns.
"4 buns, if you please," said Sarah. "Those at a penny each."
The woman went to the window and put some in a paper bag. Sarah noticed that she put in 6.
"I said 4, if you please," she explained. "I have only 4pence."
"I'll throw in 2 for make weight," said the woman with her good-natured look. "I dare say you can eat them some time. Aren't you hungry?"
A mist rose before Sarah's eyes. "Yes," she answered. "I am very hungry, and I am much obliged to you for your kindness. And," she was going to add, "there is a child outside who is hungrier than I am." But just at that moment 2 or 3 customers came in at once, and each one seemed in a hurry, so she could only thank the woman again and go out. The beggar girl was still huddled up in the corner of the step. She looked frightful in her wet and dirty rags. She was staring straight before her with a stupid look of suffering, and Sarah saw her suddenly draw the back of her roughened black hand across her eyes to rub away the tears, which seemed to have surprised her by forcing their way from under her lids. She was muttering to herself. Sarah opened the paper bag and took out one of the hot buns, which had already warmed her own cold hands a little. "See," she said, putting the bun in the ragged lap. "This is nice and hot. Eat it, and you will not feel so hungry." The child started and stared up at her, as if such sudden amazing good luck almost frightened her. Then she snatched up the bun and began to cram it into her mouth with great wolfish bites. "Oh my! Oh my!" Sarah heard her say hoarsely in wild delight. "Oh my!" Sarah took out 3 more buns and put them down. The sound in the hoarse, ravenous voice was awful. "She is hungrier than I am," she said to herself. "She's starving." But her hand trembled when she put down the 4th bun. "I'm not starving," she said, and she put down the 5th. The little ravening London savage was still snatching and devouring when she had turned away. She was too ravenous to give any thanks, even if she had ever been taught politeness, which she had not. She was only a poor little wild animal. "Good-bye," said Sarah. When she reached the other side of the street she looked back. The child had a bun in each hand and had stopped in the middle of a bite to watch her. Sarah gave her a little nod, and the child, after another stare, a curious lingering stare, jerked her shaggy head in response. Until Sarah was out of sight she did not take another bite or even finish the one she had begun. At that moment the baker woman looked out of her shop window. "Well, I never!" she exclaimed. "If that young un hasn't given her buns to a beggar child! It wasn't because she didn't want them, neither. Well, well, she looked hungry enough. I'd give something to know what she did it for." She stood behind her window for a few moments and pondered. Then her curiosity got the better of her. She went to the door and spoke to the beggar child. "Who gave you those buns?" she asked her. The child nodded her head towards Sarah's vanishing figure. "What did she say?" enquired the woman. "Asked me if I was hungry," replied the hoarse voice. "What did you say?" "Said I was, just." "And then she came in and got the buns and gave them to you, did she?" The child nodded. "How many?" "5." The woman thought it over. "Left just 1 for herself," she said in a low voice. "And she could have eaten the whole 6. I saw it in her eyes." She looked after the little draggled, far-away figure and felt more disturbed in her usually comfortable mind than she had felt for many a day. "I wish she hadn't gone so quick," she said. "I'm blessed if she shouldn't have had a dozen." Then she turned to the child. "Are you hungry yet?" she said. "I'm allus hungry," was the answer, "but 'tain't as bad as it was." "Come in here," said the woman, and she held open the shop door. The child got up and shuffled in.
To be invited into a warm place full of bread seemed an incredible thing. She did not know what was going to happen. She did not care even. "Get yourself warm," said the woman, pointing to a fire in the tiny back room. "And look here, when you are hard up for a bit of bread, you can come in here and ask for it. I'm blessed if I won't give it to you, for that young one's sake." Sarah found some comfort in her remaining bun. At all events it was very hot, and it was better than nothing. As she walked along she broke off small pieces and ate them slowly to make them last longer. "Suppose it was a magic bun," she said, "and a bite was as much as a whole dinner. I should be overeating myself if I went on like this." It was dark when she reached the square where the select seminary was situated. The lights in the houses were all lighted. The blinds were not yet drawn in the windows of the room where she nearly always caught glimpses of members of the Large family. Frequently at this hour she could see the gentleman she called Mr. Montmorency sitting in a big chair, with a small swarm round him, talking, laughing, perching on the arms of his seat, or on his knees, or leaning against them. This evening the swarm was about him, but he was not seated. On the contrary, there was a good deal of excitement going on. It was evident that a journey was to be taken, and it was Mr. Montmorency who was to take it. A brougham stood before the door, and a big portmanteau had been strapped upon it. The children were dancing about, chattering and hanging on to their father. The pretty rosy mother was standing near him, talking as if she was asking final questions. Sarah paused a moment to see the little ones lifted up and kissed, and the bigger ones bent over and kissed also. "I wonder if he will stay away long," she thought. "The portmanteau is rather big. Oh dear, how they will miss him! I shall miss him myself, even though he doesn't know I am alive." When the door opened she moved away, remembering the sixpence, but she saw the traveller come out and stand against the background of the warmly lighted hall, the older children still hovering about him. "Will Moscow be covered with snow?" said the little girl Janet. "Will there be ice everywhere?" "Shall you drive in a drosky?" cried another. "Shall you see the Tsar?" "I will write and tell you all about it," he answered, laughing. "And I will send you pictures of musiques and things. Run into the house. It is a hideous damp night. I would rather stay with you than go to Moscow. Good night. Good night, duckies. God bless you." And he ran down the steps and jumped into the brougham. "If you find the little girl, give her our love," shouted Guy Clarence, jumping up and down on the door-mat. Then they went in and shut the door. "Did you see," said Janet to Norah, as they went back to the room, "the little girl who was not a beggar was passing? She looked all cold and wet, and I saw her turn her head over her shoulder and look at us. Mamma says her clothes always look as if they had been given her by some one who was quite rich, some one who only let her have them because they were too shabby to wear. The people at the school always send her out on errands on the horridest days and nights there are." Sarah crossed the square to Miss Minchin's area steps, feeling faint and shaky. "I wonder who the little girl is," she thought. "The little girl he is going to look for." And she went down the area steps, lugging her basket and finding it very heavy indeed, as the father of the Large family drove quickly on his way to the station to take the train which was to carry him to Moscow, where he was to make his best efforts to search for the lost little daughter of Captain Crewe. End of Chapter 13. Chapter 14. What Melchizedek Heard and Saw. On this very afternoon, while Sarah was out, a strange thing happened in the attic. Only Melchizedek saw and heard it, and he was so much alarmed and mystified that he scuttled back to his hole and hid there, and really quaked and trembled as he peeped out furtively and with great caution to watch what was going on. The attic had been very still all the day after Sarah had left it in the early morning. The stillness had only been broken by the pattering of the rain upon the slates and the skylight. Melchizedek had in fact found it rather dull, and when the rain ceased to patter and perfect silence reigned, he decided to come out and reconnoitre, though experience taught him that Sarah would not return for some time. He had been rambling and sniffing about, and had just found a totally unexpected and unexplained crumb left from his last meal, when his attention was attracted by a sound on the roof. He stopped to listen with a palpitating heart. The sound suggested that something was moving on the roof. It was approaching the skylight. It reached the skylight. The skylight was being mysteriously opened. A dark face peered into the attic, then another face appeared behind it, and both looked in with signs of caution and interest. 2 men were outside on the roof, and were making silent preparations to enter through the skylight itself. One was Ram Das, and the other was a young man who was the Indian gentleman's secretary. But of course Melchizedek did not know this. He only knew that the men were invading the silence and privacy of the attic, and as the one with the dark face let himself down through the aperture with such lightness and dexterity that he did not make the slightest sound, Melchizedek turned tail and fled precipitately back to his hole. He was frightened to death. He had ceased to be timid with Sarah, and knew she would never throw anything but crumbs, and would never make any sound other than the soft, low, coaxing whistling, but strange men were dangerous things to remain near. He lay close and flat near the entrance of his home, just managing to peep through the crack with a bright, alarmed eye. How much he understood of the talk he heard I am not in the least able to say, but even if he had understood it all, he would probably have remained greatly mystified. The secretary, who was light and young, slipped through the skylight as noiselessly as Ram Das had done, and he caught a last glimpse of Melchizedek's vanishing tail. "Was that a rat?" he asked Ram Das in a whisper. "Yes, a rat, Sahib," answered Ram Das, also whispering. "There are many in the walls." "Ugh!" exclaimed the young man. "It is a wonder the child is not terrified of them." Ram Das made a gesture with his hands. He also smiled respectfully. He was in this place as the intimate exponent of Sarah, though she had only spoken to him once. "The child is the little friend of all things, Sahib," he answered. "She is not as other children. I see her when she does not see me. I slip across the slates and look at her many nights to see that she is safe. I watch her from my window when she does not know that I am near. She stands on the table there and looks out at the sky as if it spoke to her. The sparrows come at her call. The rat she has fed and tamed in her loneliness. The poor slave of the house comes to her for comfort. There is a little child who comes to her in secret. There is one older who worships her and would listen to her forever if she might. This I have seen when I have crept across the roof. By the mistress of the house, who is an evil woman, she is treated like a pariah. But she has the bearing of a child who is the blood of kings." "You seem to know a great deal about her," the secretary said. "All her life, each day I know," answered Ram Das. "Her going out I know, and her coming in, her sadness and her poor joys, her coldness and her hunger. I know when she is alone until midnight learning from her books. I know when her secret friends steal to her and she is happier, as children can be even in the midst of poverty, because they come and she may laugh and talk with them in whispers. If she were ill I should know, and I would come and serve her, if it might be done." "You are sure no one comes near this place but herself, and that she will not return and surprise us? She would be frightened if she found us here, and the Sahib Carrisford's plan would be spoiled." Ram Das crossed noiselessly to the door and stood close to it. "None mount here but herself, Sahib," he said. "She has gone out with her basket and may be gone for hours. If I stand here I can hear any step before it reaches the last flight of the stairs." The secretary took a pencil and a tablet from his breast pocket. "Keep your ears open," he said, and he began to walk slowly and softly round the miserable little room, making rapid notes on his tablet as he looked at things. First he went to the narrow bed. He pressed his hand upon the mattress and uttered an exclamation. "As hard as a stone," he said. "That will have to be altered some day when she is out. A special journey can be made to bring it across. It cannot be done tonight." He lifted the covering and examined the one thin pillow. "Coverlet dingy and worn, blanket thin, sheets patched and ragged," he said. "What a bed for a child to sleep in, and in a house which calls itself respectable. There has not been a fire in that grate for many a day," glancing at the rusty fireplace. "Never, since I have seen it," said Ram Das. "The mistress of the house is not one who remembers that another than herself may be cold." The secretary was writing quickly on his tablet. He looked up from it as he tore off a leaf and slipped it into his breast pocket. "It is a strange way of doing the thing," he said. "Who planned it?" Ram Das made a modestly apologetic obeisance. "It is true that the first thought was mine, Sahib," he said, "though it was naught but a fancy. I am fond of this child. We are both lonely. It is her way to relate her visions to her secret friends. Being sad one night, I lay close to the open skylight and listened. The vision she related told what this miserable room might be if it had comforts in it. She seemed to see it as she talked, and she grew cheered and warmed as she spoke. Then she came to this fancy, and the next day, the Sahib being ill and wretched, I told him of the thing to amuse him. It seemed then but a dream, but it pleased the Sahib. To hear of the child's doings gave him entertainment. He became interested in her and asked questions. At last he began to please himself with the thought of making her visions real things." "You think that it can be done while she sleeps? Suppose she awakened?" suggested the secretary, and it was evident that whatsoever the plan referred to was, it had caught and pleased his fancy as well as the Sahib Carrisford's. "I can move as if my feet were of velvet," Ram Das replied. "And children sleep soundly, even the unhappy ones. I could have entered this room in the night many times, and without causing her to turn upon her pillow. If the other bearer passes to me the things through the window, I can do all, and she will not stir. When she awakens she will think a magician has been here." He smiled as if his heart warmed under his white robe, and the secretary smiled back at him. "It will be like a story from the Arabian Nights," he said. "Only an Oriental could have planned it. It does not belong to London fogs." They did not remain very long, to the great relief of Melchizedek, who, as he probably did not comprehend their conversation, felt their movements and whispers ominous. The young secretary seemed interested in everything. He wrote down things about the floor, the fireplace, the broken footstool, the old table, the walls, which last he touched with his hand again and again, seeming much pleased when he found that a number of old nails had been driven in various places. "You can hang things on them," he said. Ram Das smiled mysteriously. "Yesterday, when she was out," he said, "I entered, bringing with me small sharp nails, which can be pressed into the wall without blows from a hammer. I placed many in the plaster where I may need them. They are ready." The Indian gentleman's secretary stood still and looked round him as he thrust his tablets back into his pocket. "I think I have made notes enough. We can go now," he said. "The Sahib Carrisford has a warm heart. It is 1,000 pities that he has not found the lost child." "If he should find her, his strength would be restored to him," said Ram Das. "His God may lead her to him yet." Then they slipped through the skylight as noiselessly as they had entered it, and, after he was quite sure that they had gone, Melchizedek was greatly relieved, and in the course of a few minutes felt it safe to emerge from his hole again and scuffle about in the hope that even such alarming human beings as these might have chanced to carry crumbs in their pockets and drop one or two of them. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15. The Magic. When Sarah had passed the house next door, she had seen Ram Das closing the shutters and caught her glimpse of this room also. "It is a long time since I saw a nice place from the inside," was the thought which crossed her mind. There was the usual bright fire glowing in the grate, and the Indian gentleman was sitting before it. His head was resting in his hand, and he looked as lonely and unhappy as ever. "Poor man," said Sarah, "I wonder what you are supposing." And this was what he was supposing at that very moment. "Suppose," he was thinking, "suppose, even if Carmichael traces the people to Moscow, the little girl they took from Madame Pascal's school in Paris is not the one we are in search of. Suppose she proves to be a quite different child. What step shall I take next?" When Sarah went into the house she met Miss Minchin, who had come downstairs to scold the cook. "Where have you wasted your time?" she demanded. "You've been out for hours." "It was so wet and muddy,"
Sarah answered. "It was hard to walk, because my shoes were so bad and slipped about."
"Make no excuses," said Miss Minchin, "and tell no falsehoods." Sarah went in to the cook. The cook had received a severe lecture and was in a fearful temper as a result. She was only too rejoiced to have some one to vent her rage on, and Sarah was a convenience as usual. "Why didn't you stay all night?" she snapped. Sarah laid her purchases on the table.
"Here are the things," she said.
The cook looked them over, grumbling. She was in a very savage humour indeed.
"May I have something to eat?"
Sarah asked rather faintly. "Tea's over and done with," was the answer. "Did you expect me to keep it hot for you?"
Sarah stood silent for a second. "I had no dinner," she said next, and her voice was quite low. She made it low because she was afraid it would tremble.
"There's some bread in the pantry," said the cook. "That's all you'll get at this time of day."
Sarah went and found the bread. It was old and hard and dry. The cook was in too vicious a humour to give her anything to eat with it. It was always safe and easy to vent her spite on Sarah. Really, it was hard for the child to climb the 3 long flights of stairs leading to her attic. She often found them steep and long when she was tired, but tonight it seemed as if she would never reach the top. Several times she was obliged to stop and rest. When she reached the top landing, she was glad to see the glimmer of a light coming from under her door. That meant Ermengarde had managed to creep up to pay her a visit. There was some comfort in that. It was better than to go into the room alone and find it empty and desolate. The mere presence of plump, comfortable Ermengarde, wrapped in her red shawl, would warm it a little. Yes, there Ermengarde was when she opened the door. She was sitting in the middle of the bed, with her feet tucked safely under her. She had never become intimate with Melchizedek and his family, though they rather fascinated her. When she found herself alone in the attic, she always preferred to sit on the bed until Sarah arrived. She had, in fact, on this occasion had time to become rather nervous, because Melchizedek had appeared and sniffed about a good deal, and once had made her utter a repressed squeal by sitting up on his hind legs and, while he looked at her, sniffing pointedly in her direction. "Oh, Sarah!" she cried out. "I am glad you have come. Melky would sniff about so. I tried to coax him to go back, but he wouldn't for such a long time. I like him, you know, but it does frighten me when he sniffs right at me. Do you think he ever would jump?" "No," answered Sarah. Ermengarde crawled forward on the bed to look at her. "You do look tired, Sarah," she said. "You are quite pale." "I am tired," said Sarah, dropping on to the lopsided footstool. "Oh, there's Melchizedek, poor thing. He's come to ask for his supper." Melchizedek had come out of his hole as if he had been listening for her footstep. Sarah was quite sure he knew it. He came forward with an affectionate, expectant expression, as Sarah put her hand in her pocket and turned it inside out, shaking her head. "I'm very sorry," she said. "I haven't one crumb left. Go home, Melchizedek, and tell your wife there was nothing in my pocket. I'm afraid I forgot because the cook and Miss Minchin were so cross." Melchizedek seemed to understand. He shuffled resignedly, if not contentedly, back to his home. "I did not expect to see you tonight, Ammy," Sarah said. Ermengarde hugged herself in the red shawl. "Miss Amelia has gone out to spend the night with her old aunt," she explained. "No one else ever comes and looks into the bedrooms after we are in bed. I could stay here till morning if I wanted to." She pointed toward the table under the skylight. Sarah had not looked toward it as she came in. A number of books were piled upon it. Ermengarde's gesture was a dejected one. "Papa has sent me some more books, Sarah," she said. "There they are." Sarah looked round and got up at once. She ran to the table and, picking up the top volume, turned over its leaves quickly. For the moment she forgot her discomforts. "Ah!" she cried out. "How beautiful! Carlyle's French Revolution. I have so wanted to read that." "I haven't," said Ermengarde. "And papa will be so cross if I don't. He'll expect me to know all about it when I go home for the holidays. What shall I do?" Sarah stopped turning over the leaves and looked at her with an excited flush on her cheeks. Look here, she cried. If you'll lend me these books, I'll read them and tell you everything that's in them afterward, and I'll tell it so that you will remember it too. Oh, goodness! Exclaimed Ermengarde. Do you think you can? I know I can, Sarah answered. The little ones always remember what I tell them. Sarah, said Ermengarde, hope gleaming in her round face, if you'll do that and make me remember, I'll give you anything. I don't want you to give me anything, said Sarah. I want your books. I want them. And her eyes grew big, and her chest heaved. Take them, then, said Ermengarde. I wish I wanted them, but I don't. I'm not clever, and my father is, and he thinks I ought to be. Sarah was opening one book after the other. What are you going to tell your father? She asked, a slight doubt dawning in her mind. Oh, he needn't know, answered Ermengarde. He'll think I've read them. Sarah put down her book and shook her head slowly. That's almost like telling lies, she said. And lies, well, you see, they are not only wicked, they're vulgar. Sometimes, reflectively, I've thought perhaps I might do something wicked. I might suddenly fly into a rage and kill Miss Minchin, you know, when she was ill-treating me. But I couldn't be vulgar. Why can't you tell your father I read them? He wants me to read them, said Ermengarde, a little discouraged by this unexpected turn of affairs. He wants you to know what is in them, said Sarah, and if I can tell it to you in an easy way and make you remember it, I should think he would like that. He'll like it if I learn anything in any way, said rueful Ermengarde. You would if you were my father. It's not your fault that, began Sarah. She pulled herself up and stopped rather suddenly. She had been going to say, It's not your fault that you are stupid. That what? Ermengarde asked. That you can't learn things quickly, amended Sarah. If you can't, you can't. If I can, why, I can, that's all. She had always felt very tender of Ermengarde, and tried not to let her feel too strongly the difference between being able to learn anything at once and not being able to learn anything at all. As she looked at her plump face, one of her wise, old-fashioned thoughts came to her. Perhaps, she said, to be able to learn things quickly isn't everything. To be kind is worth a great deal to other people. If Miss Minchin knew everything on earth, and was like what she is now, she'd still be a detestable thing, and everybody would hate her. Lots of clever people have done harm and been wicked. Look at Robespierre. She stopped and examined Ermengarde's countenance, which was beginning to look bewildered. Don't you remember? She demanded. I told you about him not long ago. I believe you've forgotten. Well, I don't remember all of it, admitted Ermengarde. Well, you wait a minute, said Sarah, and I'll take off my wet things and wrap myself in the coverlet and tell you over again. She took off her hat and coat and hung them on a nail against the wall, and she changed her wet shoes for an old pair of slippers. Then she jumped on the bed, and drawing the coverlet about her shoulders, sat with her arms round her knees. Now listen, she said. She plunged into the gory records of the French Revolution, and told such stories of it that Ermengarde's eyes grew round with alarm, and she held her breath. But though she was rather terrified, there was a delightful thrill in listening, and she was not likely to forget Robespierre again, or to have any doubts about the Princesse de Lamballe. You know when they put her head on a pike and danced round it, Sarah explained, and she had beautiful floating blonde hair, and when I think of her, I never see her head on her body, but always on a pike, with those furious people dancing and howling. It was agreed that Mr. St. John was to be told the plan they had made, and for the present the books were to be left in the attic. Now, let's tell each other things, said Sarah. How are you getting on with your French lessons? Ever so much better since the last time I came up here and you explained the conjugations. Miss Minchin could not understand why I did my exercises so well that first morning. Sarah laughed a little and hugged her knees. She doesn't understand why Lottie is doing her sums so well, she said, but it is because she creeps up here too, and I help her. She glanced round the room. The attic would be rather nice, if it wasn't so dreadful, she said, laughing again.
It's a good place to pretend in. The truth was that Ermengarde did not know anything of the sometimes almost unbearable side of life in the attic, and she had not a sufficiently vivid imagination to depict it for herself. On the rare occasions that she could reach Sarah's room she saw only the side of it which was made exciting by things which were pretended and stories which were told. Her visits partook of the character of adventures, and though sometimes Sarah looked rather pale, and it was not to be denied that she had grown very thin, her proud little spirit would not admit of complaints. She had never confessed that at times she was almost ravenous with hunger, as she was tonight. She was growing rapidly, and her constant walking and running about would have given her a keen appetite even if she had had abundant and regular meals of a much more nourishing nature than the unappetizing inferior food snatched at such odd times as suited the kitchen convenience. She was growing used to a certain gnawing feeling in her young stomach. "I suppose soldiers feel like this when they are on a long and weary march," she often said to herself. She liked the sound of the phrase, "long and weary march." It made her feel rather like a soldier. She had also a quaint sense of being a hostess in the attic. "If I lived in a castle," she argued, "and Ermengarde was the lady of another castle, and came to see me, with knights and squires and vassals riding with her, and pennons flying, when I heard the clarions sounding outside the drawbridge, I should go down to receive her, and I should spread feasts in the banquet hall, and call in minstrels to sing and play and relate romances. When she comes into the attic I can't spread feasts, but I can tell stories, and not let her know disagreeable things. I dare say poor chatelaines had to do that in time of famine, when their lands had been pillaged." She was a proud, brave little chatelaine, and dispensed generously the one hospitality she could offer, the dreams she dreamed, the visions she saw, the imaginings which were her joy and comfort. So, as they sat together, Ermengarde did not know that she was faint as well as ravenous, and that while she talked she now and then wondered if her hunger would let her sleep when she was left alone. She felt as if she had never been quite so hungry before. "I wish I was as thin as you, Sarah," Ermengarde said suddenly. "I believe you are thinner than you used to be. Your eyes look so big, and look at the sharp little bone sticking out of your elbow." Sarah pulled down her sleeve, which had pushed itself up. "I always was a thin child," she said bravely, "and I always had big green eyes." "I love your queer eyes," said Ermengarde, looking into them with affectionate admiration. "They always look as if they saw such a long way. I love them, and I love them to be green, though they look black generally." "They are cat's eyes," laughed Sarah. "But I can't see in the dark with them, because I have tried and I couldn't. I wish I could." It was just at this minute that something happened at the skylight which neither of them saw. If either of them had chanced to turn and look, she would have been startled by the sight of a dark face which peered cautiously into the room and disappeared as quickly and almost as silently as it had appeared. Not quite as silently, however. Sarah, who had keen ears, suddenly turned a little and looked up at the roof. "That didn't sound like Melchizedek," she said. "It wasn't scratchy enough." "What?" said Ermengarde, a little startled. "Didn't you think you heard something?" said Sarah. "No," Ermengarde faltered. "Did you?" "Perhaps I didn't," said Sarah. "But I thought I did. It sounded as if something was on the slates, something that dragged softly." "What could it be?" said Ermengarde. "Could it be robbers?" "No," Sarah began cheerfully. "There is nothing to steal." She broke off in the middle of her words. They both heard the sound that checked her. It was not on the slates, but on the stairs below, and it was Miss Minchin's angry voice. Sarah sprang off the bed and put out the candle. "She is scolding Becky," she whispered as she stood in the darkness. "She is making her cry." "Will she come in here?" Ermengarde whispered back, panic-stricken. "No, she will think I am in bed. Don't stir." It was very seldom that Miss Minchin mounted the last flight of stairs. Sarah could only remember that she had done it once before. But now she was angry enough to be coming at least part of the way up, and it sounded as if she was driving Becky before her. "You impudent, dishonest child!" they heard her say. "Cook tells me she has missed things repeatedly." "'Tweren't me, mum," said Becky, sobbing. "I was hungry enough, but 'tweren't me, never." "You deserve to be sent to prison," said Miss Minchin's voice. "Picking and stealing! Half a meat pie, indeed!" "'Tweren't me," wept Becky. "I could have eat a whole one, but I never laid a finger on it." Miss Minchin was out of breath between temper and mounting the stairs. The meat pie had been intended for her special late supper. It became apparent that she boxed Becky's ears. "Don't tell falsehoods," she said. "Go to your room this instant." Both Sarah and Ermengarde heard the slap, and then heard Becky run in her slipshod shoes up the stairs and into her attic. They heard her door shut, and knew that she threw herself upon her bed. "I could have ate 2 of 'em," they heard her cry into her pillow. "And I never took a bite. 'Twas cook give it to her policeman." Sarah stood in the middle of the room in the darkness. She was clenching her little teeth and opening and shutting fiercely her outstretched hands. She could scarcely stand still, but she dared not move until Miss Minchin had gone down the stairs, and all was still. "The wicked, cruel thing!" she burst forth. "The cook takes things herself, and then says Becky steals them. She doesn't! She doesn't! She's so hungry sometimes that she eats crusts out of the ash-barrel." She pressed her hands hard against her face and burst into passionate little sobs, and Ermengarde, hearing this unusual thing, was overawed by it. Sarah was crying, the unconquerable Sarah. It seemed to denote something new, some mood she had never known. Suppose, a new dread possibility presented itself to her kind, slow little mind all at once. She crept off the bed in the dark and found her way to the table where the candle stood. She struck a match and lit the candle. When she had lighted it, she bent forward and looked at Sarah, with her new thought growing to definite fear in her eyes. "Sarah," she said in a timid, almost awe-stricken voice. You never told me. I don't want to be rude, but are you ever hungry?" It was too much just at that moment. The barrier broke down. Sarah lifted her face from her hands. "Yes," she said in a new passionate way. "Yes, I am. I'm so hungry now that I could almost eat you. And it makes it worse to hear poor Becky. She's hungrier than I am." Ermengarde gasped. "Oh, oh!" she cried woefully. "And I never knew." "I didn't want you to know," Sarah said. "It would have made me feel like a street beggar. I know I look like a street beggar." "No, you don't, you don't!" Ermengarde broke in. "Your clothes are a little queer, but you couldn't look like a street beggar. You haven't a street beggar face." "A little boy once gave me a 6pence for charity," said Sarah, with a short little laugh in spite of herself. "Here it is." And she pulled out the thin ribbon from her neck. "He wouldn't have given me his Christmas 6pence if I hadn't looked as if I needed it." Somehow the sight of the dear little 6pence was good for both of them. It made them laugh a little, though they both had tears in their eyes. "Who was he?" said Ermengarde, looking at it quite as if it had not been a mere ordinary silver 6pence. "He was a darling little thing going to a party," said Sarah. "He was one of the large family, the little one with the round legs, the one I call Guy Clarence. I suppose his nursery was crammed with Christmas presents and hampers full of cakes and things, and he could see I had nothing." Ermengarde gave a little jump backward. The last sentences had recalled something to her troubled mind and given her a sudden inspiration. "Oh, Sarah!" she cried. "What a silly thing I am not to have thought of it!" "Of what?" "Something splendid," said Ermengarde in an excited hurry. "This very afternoon my nicest aunt sent me a box. It is full of good things. I never touched it, I had so much pudding at dinner, and I was so bothered about papa's books." Her words began to tumble over each other. "It's got cake in it, and little meat pies, and jam tarts, and buns, and oranges, and red currant wine, and figs, and chocolate. I'll creep back to my room and get it this minute, and we'll eat it now. Sarah almost reeled. When one is faint with hunger, the mention of food has sometimes a curious effect. She clutched Ermengarde's arm. "Do you think you could?" she ejaculated. "I know I could," answered Ermengarde, and she ran to the door, opened it softly, put her head out into the darkness, and listened. Then she went back to Sarah. "The lights are out, everybody's in bed. I can creep, and no one will hear." It was so delightful that they caught each other's hands, and a sudden light sprang into Sarah's eyes. "Ermy," she said, let us pretend it's a party. And oh, won't you invite the prisoner in the next cell? Yes, yes, let us knock on the wall now. The jailer won't hear." Sarah went to the wall, through which she could hear poor Becky crying more softly. She knocked 4 times. "That means, come to me through the secret passage under the wall," she explained. "I have something to communicate." 5 quick knocks answered her. "She is coming," she said. Almost immediately the door of the attic opened and Becky appeared. Her eyes were red and her cap was sliding off, and when she caught sight of Ermengarde she began to rub her face nervously with her apron. "Don't mind me a bit, Becky," cried Ermengarde. "Miss Ermengarde has asked you to come in," said Sarah, "because she is going to bring a box of good things up here to us." Becky's cap almost fell off entirely, she broke in with such excitement. "To eat, miss," she said. "Things that's good to eat." "Yes," answered Sarah, "and we are going to pretend a party." "And you shall have as much as you want to eat," put in Ermengarde. "I'll go this minute." She was in such haste that as she tiptoed out of the attic she dropped her red shawl and did not know it had fallen. No one saw it for a minute or two. Becky was too much overpowered by the good luck which had befallen her. Oh, miss," she gasped. "I know it was you that asked her to let me come. It makes me cry to think of it." And she went to Sarah's side and stood and looked at her worshippingly. But in Sarah's hungry eyes the old light had begun to glow and transform her world for her. Here in the attic, with the cold night outside, with the afternoon in the sloppy streets barely past, with the memory of the awful, unfed look in the beggar child's eyes not yet faded, this simple, cheerful thing had happened like a thing of magic. She caught her breath. "Somehow, something always happens," she cried, "just before things get to the very worst. It is as if the magic did it. If I could only just remember that always. The worst thing never quite comes." She gave Becky a little cheerful shake. "No, no, you mustn't cry," she said. "We must make haste and set the table." "Set the table, miss?" said Becky, gazing round the room. "What'll we set it with?" Sarah looked round the attic too. "There doesn't seem to be much," she answered, half laughing. That moment she saw something and pounced upon it. It was Ermengarde's red shawl, which lay upon the floor. "Here's the shawl," she cried. "I know she won't mind it. It will make such a nice red tablecloth." They pulled the old table forward and threw the shawl over it. Red is a wonderfully kind and comfortable colour. It began to make the room look furnished directly. "How nice a red rug would look on the floor!" exclaimed Sarah. "We must pretend there is one." Her eye swept the bare boards with a swift glance of admiration. The rug was laid down already. "How soft and thick it is!" she said, with a little laugh which Becky knew the meaning of, and she raised and set her foot down again delicately, as if she felt something under it. "Yes, miss," answered Becky, watching her with serious rapture. She was always quite serious. "What next now?" said Sarah, and she stood still and put her hands over her eyes. "Something will come if I think and wait a little," in a soft, expectant voice. "The magic will tell me." One of her favourite fancies was that, on the outside, as she called it, thoughts were waiting for people to call them. Becky had seen her stand and wait many a time before, and knew that in a few seconds she would uncover an enlightened, laughing face. In a moment she did. "There!"
she cried. "It has come! I know now! I must look among the things in the old trunk I had when I was a princess." She flew to its corner and kneeled down. It had not been put in the attic for her benefit, but because there was no room for it elsewhere. Nothing had been left in it but rubbish. But she knew she should find something. The magic always arranged that kind of thing in one way or another. In a corner lay a package so insignificant-looking that it had been overlooked, and when she herself had found it she had kept it as a relic. It contained a dozen small white handkerchiefs. She seized them joyfully and ran to the table. She began to arrange them upon the red table-cover, patting and coaxing them into shape, with the narrow lace edge curling outward, her magic working its spells for her as she did it. "These are the plates," she said. "They are golden plates. These are the richly embroidered napkins. Nuns worked them in convents in Spain." "Did they, miss?" breathed Becky, her very soul uplifted by the information. "You must pretend it," said Sarah. "If you pretend it enough, you will see them." "Yes, miss," said Becky. And as Sarah returned to the trunk, she devoted herself to the effort of accomplishing an end so much to be desired. Sarah turned suddenly to find her standing by the table, looking very queer indeed. She had shut her eyes, and was twisting her face in strange, convulsive contortions, her hands hanging stiffly clenched at her sides. She looked as if she was trying to lift some enormous weight. "What is the matter, Becky?" Sarah cried. "What are you doing?" Becky opened her eyes with a start. "I was pretending, miss," she answered a little sheepishly. "I was trying to see it like you do. I almost did," with a hopeful grin. "But it takes a lot of strength." "Perhaps it does if you are not used to it," said Sarah, with friendly sympathy. "But you don't know how easy it is when you've done it often. I wouldn't try so hard just at first. It will come to you after a while. I'll just tell you what things are. Look at these." She held an old summer hat in her hand which she had fished out of the bottom of the trunk. There was a wreath of flowers on it. She pulled the wreath off. "These are garlands for the feast," she said grandly. "They fill all the air with perfume. There's a mug on the washstand, Becky. Oh, and bring the soap dish for a centrepiece." Becky handed them to her reverently. "What are they now, miss?" she inquired. "You'd think they was made of crockery, but I know they ain't." "This is a carven flagon," said Sarah, arranging tendrils of the wreath about the mug. "And this," bending tenderly over the soap dish and heaping it with roses, "is purest alabaster encrusted with gems." She touched the things gently, a happy smile hovering about her lips, which made her look as if she were a creature in a dream. "My, ain't it lovely?" whispered Becky. "If we just had something for bonbon dishes," Sarah murmured. "There!" darting to the trunk again. "I remember I saw something this minute." It was only a bundle of wool wrapped in red and white tissue paper, but the tissue paper was soon twisted into the form of little dishes, and was combined with the remaining flowers to ornament the candlestick which was to light the feast. Only the magic could have made it more than an old table covered with a red shawl and set with rubbish from a long unopened trunk. But Sarah drew back and gazed at it, seeing wonders. And Becky, after staring in delight, spoke with bated breath. "This here," she suggested, with a glance round the attic. "Is it the Bastille now, or has it turned into something different?" "Oh, yes, yes," said Sarah. "Quite different. It is a banquet hall." "My eye, miss!" ejaculated Becky. "A blanket hall!" And as she turned to view the splendours about her with awed bewilderment. "A banquet hall," said Sarah. "A vast chamber where feasts are given. It has a vaulted roof, and a minstrel's gallery, and a huge chimney filled with blazing oaken logs, and it is brilliant with waxen tapers twinkling on every side." "My eye, Miss Sarah!" gasped Becky again. Then the door opened and Ermengarde came in, rather staggering under the weight of her hamper. She started back with an exclamation of joy. To enter from the chill darkness outside
and find oneself confronted by a totally unanticipated festal board, draped with red, adorned with white napery, and wreathed with flowers, was to feel that the preparations were brilliant indeed. "Oh, Sarah!" she cried out, "you are the cleverest girl I ever saw." "Isn't it nice?" said Sarah. "They are things out of my old trunk. I asked my magic, and it told me to go and look." "But oh, miss!" cried Becky, "wait till she's told you what they are. They ain't just oh, miss, please tell her," appealing to Sarah. So Sarah told her, and because her magic helped her, she made her almost see it all: the golden platters, the vaulted spaces, the blazing logs, the twinkling waxen tapers. As the things were taken out of the hamper, the frosted cakes, the fruits, the bonbons, and the wine, the feast became a splendid thing. "It's like a real party," cried Ermengarde. "It's like a queen's table," sighed Becky. Then Ermengarde had a sudden brilliant thought. "I'll tell you what, Sarah," she said. "Pretend you are a princess now, and this is a royal feast." "But it's your feast," said Sarah. "You must be the princess, and we will be your maids of honour." "Oh, I can't," said Ermengarde. "I'm too fat, and I don't know how. You be her." "Well, if you want me to," said Sarah. But suddenly she thought of something else, and ran to the rusty grate. "There is a lot of paper and rubbish stuffed in here," she exclaimed. "If we light it, there will be a bright blaze for a few minutes, and we shall feel as if it was a real fire." She struck a match, and lighted it up with a great specious glow which illuminated the room. "By the time it stops blazing," Sarah said, "we shall forget about its not being real." She stood in the dancing glow and smiled. "Doesn't it look real?" she said. "Now we will begin the party." She led the way to the table. She waved her hand graciously to Ermengarde and Becky. She was in the midst of her dream. "Advance, fair damsels," she said in her happy dream voice, "and be seated at the banquet table. My noble father the king, who is absent on a long journey, has commanded me to feast you." She turned her head slightly toward the corner of the room. "What ho there, minstrels! Strike up with your viols and bassoons. Princesses," she explained rapidly to Ermengarde and Becky, "always had minstrels to play at their feasts. Pretend there is a minstrel gallery up there in the corner. Now we will begin." They had barely had time to take their pieces of cake into their hands, not one of them had time to do more, when they all three sprang to their feet and turned pale faces toward the door, listening, listening. Someone was coming up the stairs. There was no mistake about it. Each of them recognized the angry mounting tread, and knew that the end of all things had come. "It's the missus!" choked Becky, and dropped her piece of cake upon the floor. "Yes," said Sarah, her eyes growing shocked and large in her small white face. "Miss Minchin has found us out." Miss Minchin struck the door open with a blow of her hand. She was pale herself, but it was with rage. She looked from the frightened faces to the banquet table, and from the banquet table to the last flicker of the burnt paper in the grate. "I have been suspecting something of this sort," she exclaimed, "but I did not dream of such audacity. Lavinia was telling the truth." So they knew that it was Lavinia who had somehow guessed their secret and had betrayed them. Miss Minchin strode over to Becky and boxed her ears for a second time. "You impudent creature!" she said. "You leave the house in the morning." Sarah stood quite still, her eyes growing larger, her face paler. Ermengarde burst into tears. "Oh, don't send her away," she sobbed. "My aunt sent me the hamper. We're only having a party." "So I see," said Miss Minchin witheringly, "with the Princess Sarah at the head of the table." She turned fiercely on Sarah. "It is your doing, I know," she cried. "Ermengarde would never have thought of such a thing. You decorated the table, I suppose, with this rubbish." She stamped her foot at Becky. "Go to your attic," she commanded, and Becky stole away, her face hidden in her apron, her shoulders shaking. Then it was Sarah's turn again. "I will attend to you tomorrow. You shall have neither breakfast, dinner, nor supper." "I have not had either dinner or supper to-day, Miss Minchin," said Sarah rather faintly. "Then all the better. You will have something to remember. Don't stand there. Put those things into the hamper again." She began to sweep them off the table into the hamper herself, and caught sight of Ermengarde's new books. "And you," to Ermengarde, "have brought your beautiful new books into this dirty attic. Take them up and go back to bed. You will stay there all day tomorrow, and I shall write to your papa. What would he say if he knew where you are tonight?" Something she saw in Sarah's grave, fixed gaze at this moment made her turn on her fiercely. "What are you thinking of?" she demanded. "Why do you look at me like that?" "I was wondering," answered Sarah, as she had answered that notable day in the schoolroom. "What were you wondering?" It was very like the scene in the schoolroom. There was no pertness in Sarah's manner. It was only sad and quiet. "I was wondering," she said in a low voice, "what my papa would say if he knew where I am tonight." Miss Minchin was infuriated, just as she had been before, and her anger expressed itself, as before, in an intemperate fashion. She flew at her and shook her. "You insolent, unmanageable child!" she cried. "How dare you? How dare you?" She picked up the books, swept the rest of the feast back into the hamper in a jumbled heap, thrust it into Ermengarde's arms, and pushed her before her toward the door. "I will leave you to wonder," she said. "Go to bed this instant." And she shut the door behind herself and poor stumbling Ermengarde, and left Sarah standing quite alone. The dream was quite at an end. The last spark had died out of the paper in the grate, and left only black tinder. The table was left bare, the golden plates and richly embroidered napkins, and the garlands were transformed again into old handkerchiefs, scraps of red and white paper, and discarded artificial flowers all scattered on the floor. The minstrels in the minstrel gallery had stolen away, and the viols and bassoons were still. Emily was sitting with her back against the wall, staring very hard. Sarah saw her, and went and picked her up with trembling hands. "There isn't any banquet left, Emily," she said. "And there isn't any princess. There is nothing left but the prisoners in the Bastille." And she sat down and hid her face. What would have happened if she had not hidden it just then, and if she had chanced to look up at the skylight at the wrong moment, I do not know. Perhaps the end of this chapter might have been quite different, because if she had glanced at the skylight she would certainly have been startled by what she would have seen. She would have seen exactly the same face pressed against the glass and peering in at her, as it had peered in earlier in the evening when she had been talking to Ermengarde. But she did not look up. She sat with her little black head in her arms for some time. She always sat like that when she was trying to bear something in silence. Then she got up and went slowly to the bed. "I can't pretend anything else while I am awake," she said. "There wouldn't be any use in trying. If I go to sleep, perhaps a dream will come and pretend for me." She suddenly felt so tired, perhaps through want of food, that she sat down on the edge of the bed quite weakly. "Suppose there was a bright fire in the grate, with lots of little dancing flames," she murmured. "Suppose there was a comfortable chair before it, and suppose there was a small table near, with a little hot supper on it. And suppose," as she drew the thin coverings over her, "suppose this was a beautiful soft bed with fleecy blankets and large downy pillows. Suppose. And her very weariness was good to her, for her eyes closed and she fell fast asleep. She did not know how long she slept, but she had been tired enough to sleep deeply and profoundly, too deeply and soundly to be disturbed by anything, even by the squeaks and scamperings of Melchisedec's entire family, if all his sons and daughters had chosen to come out of their hole to fight and tumble and play. When she awakened it was rather suddenly, and she did not know that any particular thing had called her out of her sleep. The truth was, however, that it was a sound which had called her back, a real sound, the click of the skylight as it fell in closing after a lithe white figure which slipped through it and crouched down close by upon the slates of the roof, just near enough to see what happened in the attic, but not near enough to be seen. At first she did not open her eyes. She felt too sleepy, and, curiously enough, too warm and comfortable. She was so warm and comfortable indeed that she did not believe she was really awake. She never was as warm and cosy as this, except in some lovely vision. "What a nice dream," she murmured. "I feel quite warm. I don't want to wake up." Of course it was a dream. She felt as if warm, delightful bedclothes were heaped upon her. She could actually feel blankets, and when she put out her hand it touched something exactly like a satin-covered eider-down quilt. She must not awaken from this delight. She must be quite still and make it last. But she could not. Even though she kept her eyes closed tightly, she could not. Something was forcing her to awaken, something in the room. It was a sense of light and a sound, the sound of a crackling, roaring little fire. "Oh, I am awakening," she said mournfully. "I can't help it. I can't." Her eyes opened in spite of herself, and then she actually smiled, for what she saw she had never seen in the attic before, and knew she never should see. "Oh, I haven't awakened," she whispered, daring to rise on her elbow and look all about her. "I am dreaming yet." She knew it must be a dream, for if she were awake, such things could not be. Do you wonder that she felt sure she had not come back to earth? This is what she saw. In the grate there was a glowing, blazing fire. On the hob was a little brass kettle, hissing and boiling. Spread upon the floor was a thick, warm, crimson rug. Before the fire a folding chair, unfolded, and with cushions on it. By the chair a small folding table, unfolded, covered with a white cloth, and upon it spread small covered dishes, a cup, a saucer, a teapot. On the bed were new warm coverings and a satin-covered down quilt. At the foot a curious wadded silk robe, a pair of quilted slippers, and some books. The room of her dream seemed changed into fairyland, and it was flooded with warm light, for a bright lamp stood on the table, covered with a rosy shade. She sat up, resting on her elbow, and her breathing came short and fast. "It does not melt away," she panted. "Oh, I never had such a dream before." She scarcely dared to stir, but at last she pushed the bedclothes aside and put her feet on the floor with a rapturous smile. "I am dreaming. I am getting out of bed," she heard her own voice say. And then, as she stood up in the midst of it all, turning slowly from side to side, "I am dreaming it stays real. I'm dreaming it feels real. It's bewitched, or I'm bewitched. I only think I see it all." Her words began to hurry themselves. "If I can only keep on thinking it," she cried, "I don't care. I don't care." She stood panting a moment longer, and then cried out again. "Oh, it isn't true," she said. "It can't be true. But oh, how true it seems." The blazing fire drew her to it, and she knelt down and held out her hands close to it, so close that the heat made her start back. "A fire I only dreamed wouldn't be hot," she cried. She sprang up, touched the table, the dishes, the rug. She went to the bed and touched the blankets. She took up the soft wadded dressing-gown and suddenly clutched it to her breast and held it to her cheek. "It's warm! It's soft!" she almost sobbed. "It's real! It must be!" She threw it over her shoulders and put her feet into the slippers. They are real too. It's all real. I am not dreaming. She almost staggered to the books and opened the one which lay upon the top. Something was written on the fly-leaf, just a few words, and they were these: To the little girl in the attic, from a friend. When she saw that, wasn't it a strange thing for her to do? She put her face down upon the page and burst into tears. "I don't know who it is," she said, "but somebody cares for me a little. I have a friend." She took her candle and stole out of her own room and into Becky's and stood by her bedside. "Becky! Becky!" she whispered as loudly as she dared. "Wake up!" When Becky wakened and she sat upright staring aghast, her face still smudged with traces of tears, beside her stood a little figure in a luxurious wadded robe of crimson silk. The face she saw was a shining, wonderful thing. The Princess Sarah, as she remembered her, stood at her very bedside, holding a candle in her hand. "Come," she said. "Oh, Becky, come!" Becky was too frightened to speak. She simply got up and followed her, with her mouth and eyes open, and without a word. And when they crossed the threshold, Sarah shut the door gently and drew her into the warm, glowing midst of things which made her brain reel and her hungry senses faint. "It's true, it's true!" she cried. "I've touched them all. They are as real as we are. The magic has come and done it, Becky, while we were asleep. The magic that won't let those worst things ever quite happen." End of chapter 15.
Chapter 16. The Visitor. Imagine, if you can, what the rest of the evening was like. How they crouched by the fire which blazed and leaped and made so much of itself in the little grate. How they removed the covers of the dishes and found rich, hot, savoury soup, which was a meal in itself, and sandwiches and toast and muffins enough for both of them. The mug from the washstand was used as Becky's teacup, and the tea was so delicious that it was not necessary to pretend that it was anything but tea. They were warm and full-fed and happy, and it was just like Sarah that, having found her strange good fortune real, she should give herself up to the enjoyment of it to the utmost. She had lived such a life of imaginings that she was quite equal to accepting any wonderful thing that happened, and almost to cease, in a short time, to find it bewildering. "I don't know any one in the world who could have done it," she said, "but there has been some one, and here we are sitting by their fire, and it's true. And whoever it is, whoever they are, I have a friend, Becky. Someone is my friend." It cannot be denied that as they sat before the blazing fire and ate the nourishing, comfortable food, they felt a kind of rapturous awe, and looked into each other's eyes with something like doubt. "Do you think," Becky faltered once in a whisper, "do you think it could melt away, miss? Hadn't we better be quick?" And she hastily crammed her sandwich into her mouth. If it was only a dream, kitchen manners would be overlooked. "No, it won't melt away," said Sarah. "I am eating this muffin, and I can taste it. You never really eat things in dreams. You only think you are going to eat them. Besides, I keep giving myself pinches, and I touched a hot piece of coal just now on purpose." The sleepy comfort which at length almost overpowered them was a heavenly thing. It was the drowsiness of happy, well-fed childhood, and they sat in the fire-glow and luxuriated in it until Sarah found herself turning to look at her transformed bed. There were even blankets enough to share with Becky. The narrow couch in the next attic was more comfortable that night than its occupant had ever dreamed that it could be. As she went out of the room, Becky turned upon the threshold and looked about her with devouring eyes. "If it ain't here in the morning, miss," she said, "it's been here to-night anyways, and I shall never forget it." She looked at each particular thing as if to commit it to memory. "The fire was there," pointing with her finger, "and the table was before it, and the lamp was there, and the light looked rosy red, and there was a satin cover on your bed,
and a warm rug on the floor, and everything looked beautiful, and—" She paused a second, and laid her hand on her stomach tenderly. "There was soup and sandwiches and muffins. There was." And, with this conviction a reality at last, she went away. Through the mysterious agency which works in schools and among servants, it was quite well known in the morning that Sarah Crewe was in horrible disgrace, that Ermengarde was under punishment, and that Becky would have been packed out of the house before breakfast, but that a scullery maid could not be dispensed with at once. The servants knew that she was allowed to stay, because Miss Minchin could not easily find another creature helpless and humble enough to work like a bounden slave for so few shillings a week. The elder girls in the schoolroom knew that if Miss Minchin did not send Sarah away it was for practical reasons of her own. "She's growing so fast and learning such a lot somehow," said Jessie to Lavinia, "that she will be given classes soon, and Miss Minchin knows she will have to work for nothing. It was rather nasty of you, Lavvy, to tell about her having fun in the garret. How did you find it out?" "I got it out of Lottie. She's such a baby she didn't know she was telling me. There was nothing nasty at all in speaking to Miss Minchin. I felt it my duty." "Priggishly." "She was being deceitful, and it's ridiculous that she should look so grand, and be made so much of, in her rags and tatters." "What were they doing when Miss Minchin caught them?" "Pretending some silly thing. Ermengarde had taken up her hamper to share with Sarah and Becky. She never invites us to share things. Not that I care, but it's rather vulgar of her to share with servant girls in attics. I wonder Miss Minchin didn't turn Sarah out, even if she does want her for a teacher." "If she was turned out, where would she go?" inquired Jessie, a trifle anxiously. "How do I know?" snapped Lavinia. "She'll look rather queer when she comes into the schoolroom this morning, I should think, after what's happened. She had no dinner yesterday, and she's not to have any to-day." Jessie was not as ill-natured as she was silly. She picked up her book with a little jerk. "Well, I think it's horrid," she said. "They've no right to starve her to death." When Sarah went into the kitchen that morning, the cook looked askance at her, and so did the housemaids, but she passed them hurriedly. She had, in fact, overslept herself a little, and as Becky had done the same, neither had had time to see the other, and each had come downstairs in haste. Sarah went into the scullery. Becky was violently scrubbing a kettle, and was actually gurgling a little song in her throat. She looked up with a wildly elated face. "It was there when I wakened, miss, the blanket," she whispered excitedly. "It was as real as it was last night." "So was mine," said Sarah. "It is all there now, all of it. When I was dressing I ate some of the cold things we left." "Oh, laws, oh, laws!" Becky uttered the exclamation in a sort of rapturous groan, and ducked her head over her kettle just in time, as the cook came in from the kitchen. Miss Minchin had expected to see in Sarah, when she appeared in the schoolroom, very much what Lavinia had expected to see. Sarah had always been an annoying puzzle to her, because severity never made her cry or look frightened. When she was scolded, she stood still and listened politely with a grave face. When she was punished, she performed her extra tasks or went without her meals, making no complaint or outward sign of rebellion. The very fact that she never made an impudent answer seemed to Miss Minchin a kind of impudence in itself. But after yesterday's deprivation of meals, the violent scene of last night, the prospect of hunger to-day, she must surely have broken down. It would be strange indeed if she did not come downstairs with pale cheeks and red eyes and an unhappy, humbled face. Miss Minchin saw her for the first time when she entered the schoolroom to hear the little French class recite its lessons and superintend its exercises. And she came in with a springing step, colour in her cheeks, and a smile hovering about the corners of her mouth. It was the most astonishing thing Miss Minchin had ever known. It gave her quite a shock. What was the child made of? What could such a thing mean? She called her at once to her desk. "You do not look as if you realise that you are in disgrace," she said. "Are you absolutely hardened?" The truth is that when one is still a child, or even if one is grown up, and has been well fed, and has slept long and softly and warm, when one has gone to sleep in the midst of a fairy story, and has wakened to find it real,
One cannot be unhappy, or even look as if one were, and one could not, if one tried, keep a glow of joy out of one's eyes. Miss Minchin was almost struck dumb by the look of Sarah's eyes when she made her perfectly respectful answer. "I beg your pardon, Miss Minchin," she said. "I know that I am in disgrace." "Be good enough not to forget it, and look as if you had come into a fortune. It is an impertinence. And remember, you are to have no food to-day." "Yes, Miss Minchin," Sarah answered. But as she turned away, her heart leaped with the memory of what yesterday had been. "If the magic had not saved me just in time," she thought, "how horrible it would have been." "She can't be very hungry," whispered Lavinia. "Just look at her. Perhaps she is pretending she has had a good breakfast," with a spiteful laugh. "She's different from other people," said Jessie, watching Sarah with her class. "Sometimes I'm a bit frightened of her." "Ridiculous thing!" ejaculated Lavinia. All through the day the light was in Sarah's face and the colour in her cheek. The servants cast puzzled glances at her, and whispered to each other, and Miss Amelia's small blue eyes wore an expression of bewilderment. What such an audacious look of well-being, under august displeasure, could mean, she could not understand. It was, however, just like Sarah's singular obstinate way. She was probably determined to brave the matter out. One thing Sarah had resolved upon, as she thought things over. The wonders which had happened must be kept a secret, if such a thing were possible. If Miss Minchin should choose to mount to the attic again, of course all would be discovered. But it did not seem likely that she would do so, for some time at least, unless she was led by suspicion. Ermengarde and Lottie would be watched with such strictness that they would not dare to steal out of their beds again. Ermengarde could be told the story, and trusted to keep it secret. If Lottie made any discoveries, she could be bound to secrecy also. Perhaps the magic itself would help to hide its own marvels. "But whatever happens," Sarah kept saying to herself all day, "whatever happens, somewhere in the world there is a heavenly, kind person who is my friend. My friend. If I never know who it is, if I never can even thank him, I shall never feel quite so lonely. Oh, the magic was good to me." If it was possible for weather to be worse than it had been the day before, it was worse this day. Wetter, muddier, colder. There were more errands to be done, the cook was more irritable, and knowing that Sarah was in disgrace, she was more savage. But what does anything matter when one's magic has just proved itself one's friend? Sarah's supper of the night before had given her strength. She knew that she should sleep well and warmly, and even though she had naturally begun to be hungry again before evening, she felt that she could bear it until breakfast time on the following day, when her meals would surely be given to her again. It was quite late when she was at last allowed to go upstairs. She had been told to go into the schoolroom and study until 10 o'clock, and she had become interested in her work and remained over her books later. When she reached the top flight of stairs and stood before the attic door, it must be confessed that her heart beat rather fast. "Of course, it might all have been taken away," she whispered, trying to be brave. "It might only have been lent to me for just that one awful night. But it was lent to me. I had it. It was real." She pushed the door open and went in. Once inside, she gasped slightly, shut the door, and stood with her back against it, looking from side to side. The magic had been there again. It actually had, and it had done even more than before. The fire was blazing, in lovely leaping flames, more merrily than ever. A number of new things had been brought into the attic, which so altered the look of it that if she had not been past doubting she would have rubbed her eyes. Upon the low table another supper stood, this time with cups and plates for Becky as well as herself. A piece of bright, heavy, strange embroidery covered the battered mantel, and on it some ornaments had been placed. All the bare, ugly things which could be covered with draperies had been concealed and made to look quite pretty. Some odd materials of rich colours had been fastened against the wall with fine, sharp tacks, so sharp that they could be pressed into the wood and plaster without hammering. Some brilliant fans were pinned up, and there were several large cushions, big and substantial enough to use as seats. A wooden box was covered with a rug, and some cushions lay on it, so that it wore quite the air of a sofa. Sarah slowly moved away from the door, and simply sat down and looked again. "It is exactly like something fairy come true," she said. "There isn't the least difference. I feel as if I might wish for anything, diamonds or bags of gold, and they would appear. That wouldn't be any stranger than this. Is this my garret? Am I the same cold, ragged, damp Sarah? And to think I used to pretend and wish there were fairies. The one thing I always wanted was to see a fairy story come true. I am living in a fairy story. I feel as if I might be a fairy myself, and able to turn things into anything else." She rose and knocked upon the wall for the prisoner in the next cell, and the prisoner came. When she entered she almost dropped in a heap upon the floor. For a few seconds she quite lost her breath. "Oh, laws!" she gasped. "Oh, laws, miss!" "You see," said Sarah. On this night Becky sat on a cushion upon the hearthrug and had a cup and saucer of her own. When Sarah went to bed she found that she had a new thick mattress and big downy pillows. Her old mattress and pillow had been removed to Becky's bedstead, and consequently, with these additions, Becky had been supplied with unheard-of comfort. "Where does it all come from?" Becky broke forth once. "Laws, who does it, miss?" "Don't let us even ask," said Sarah. "If it were not that I want to say, 'Oh, thank you,' I would rather not know. It makes it more beautiful." From that time life became more wonderful day by day. The fairy story continued. Almost every day something new was done. Some new comfort or ornament appeared each time Sarah opened the door at night, until in a short time the attic was a beautiful little room full of all sorts of odd and luxurious things. The ugly walls were gradually entirely covered with pictures and draperies. Ingenious pieces of folding furniture appeared. A bookshelf was hung up and filled with books. New comforts and conveniences appeared one by one, until there seemed nothing left to be desired. When Sarah went downstairs in the morning, the remains of the supper were still on the table, and when she returned to the attic in the evening, the magician had removed them and left another nice little meal. Miss Minchin was as harsh and insulting as ever, Miss Amelia as peevish, and the servants were as vulgar and rude. Sarah was sent on errands in all weathers, and scolded and driven hither and thither. She was scarcely allowed to speak to Ermengarde and Lottie. Lavinia sneered at the increasing shabbiness of her clothes, and the other girls stared curiously at her when she appeared in the schoolroom. But what did it all matter, while she was living in this wonderful, mysterious story? It was more romantic and delightful than anything she had ever invented to comfort her starved young soul and save herself from despair. Sometimes, when she was scolded, she could scarcely keep from smiling. "If you only knew," she was saying to herself, "if you only knew." The comfort and happiness she enjoyed were making her stronger, and she had them always to look forward to. If she came home from her errands wet and tired and hungry, she knew she would soon be warm and well fed after she had climbed the stairs. During the hardest day she could occupy herself blissfully by thinking of what she should see when she opened the attic door, and wondering what new delight had been prepared for her. In a very short time she began to look less thin. Colour came into her cheeks, and her eyes did not seem so much too big for her face. "Sarah Crewe looks wonderfully well," Miss Minchin remarked disapprovingly to her sister. "Yes," answered poor silly Miss Amelia. "She is absolutely fattening. She was beginning to look like a little starved crow." "Starved!" exclaimed Miss Minchin angrily. "There was no reason why she should look starved. She always had plenty to eat." Of course," agreed Miss Amelia humbly, alarmed to find that she had, as usual, said the wrong thing. "There is something very disagreeable in seeing that sort of thing in a child of her age," said Miss Minchin, with haughty vagueness. "What sort of thing?" Miss Amelia ventured. "It might almost be called defiance," answered Miss Minchin, feeling annoyed because she knew the thing she resented was nothing like defiance,
and she did not know what other unpleasant term to use. The spirit and will of any other child would have been entirely humbled and broken by the changes she has had to submit to. But upon my word, she seems as little subdued as if she were a princess." "Do you remember," put in the unwise Miss Amelia, "what she said to you that day in the schoolroom about what you would do if you found out that she was—" "No, I don't," said Miss Minchin. "Don't talk nonsense." But she remembered very clearly indeed. Very naturally, even Becky was beginning to look plumper and less frightened. She could not help it. She had her share in the secret fairy story too. She had 2 mattresses, 2 pillows, plenty of bed covering, and every night a hot supper and a seat on the cushions by the fire. The Bastille had melted away, the prisoners no longer existed. 2 comforted children sat in the midst of delights. Sometimes Sarah read aloud from her books, sometimes she learned her own lessons, sometimes she sat and looked into the fire and tried to imagine who her friend could be, and wished she could say to him some of the things in her heart. Then it came about that another wonderful thing happened. A man came to the door and left several parcels. All were addressed in large letters, "To the little girl in the right-hand attic." Sarah herself was sent to open the door and take them in. She laid the 2 largest parcels on the hall table and was looking at the address when Miss Minchin came down the stairs and saw her. "Take the things to the young lady to whom they belong," she said severely. "Don't stand there staring at them." "They belong to me," answered Sarah quietly. "To you?" exclaimed Miss Minchin. "What do you mean?" "I don't know where they come from," said Sarah, "but they are addressed to me. I sleep in the right-hand attic. Becky has the other one." Miss Minchin came to her side and looked at the parcels with an excited expression. "What is in them?" she demanded. "I don't know," replied Sarah. "Open them," she ordered. Sarah did as she was told. When the packages were unfolded, Miss Minchin's countenance wore suddenly a singular expression. What she saw was pretty and comfortable clothing of different kinds, shoes, stockings and gloves, and a warm and beautiful coat. There were even a nice hat and an umbrella. They were all good and expensive things, and on the pocket of the coat was pinned a paper on which were written these words: "To be worn every day, will be replaced by others when necessary." Miss Minchin was quite agitated. This was an incident which suggested strange things to her sordid mind. Could it be that she had made a mistake after all, and that the neglected child had some powerful though eccentric friend in the background, perhaps some previously unknown relation who had suddenly traced her whereabouts and chose to provide for her in this mysterious and fantastic way? Relations were sometimes very odd, particularly rich old bachelor uncles who did not care for having children near them. A man of that sort might prefer to overlook his young relation's welfare at a distance. Such a person, however, would be sure to be crotchety and hot-tempered enough to be easily offended. It would not be very pleasant if there were such a one, and he should learn all the truth about the thin, shabby clothes, the scant food, and the hard work. She felt very queer indeed, and very uncertain, and she gave a side glance at Sarah. "Well," she said, in a voice such as she had never used since the little girl lost her father, "some one is very kind to you. As the things have been sent, and you are to have new ones when they are worn out, you may as well go and put them on and look respectable. After you are dressed you may come downstairs and learn your lessons in the schoolroom. You need not go out on any more errands to-day." About half an hour afterward, when the schoolroom door opened and Sarah walked in, the entire seminary was struck dumb. "My word!" ejaculated Jessie, jogging Lavinia's elbow. "Look at the Princess Sarah!" Everybody was looking, and when Lavinia looked she turned quite red. It was the Princess Sarah indeed. At least since the days when she had been a princess, Sarah had never looked as she did now. She did not seem the Sarah they had seen come down the back stairs a few hours ago. She was dressed in the kind of frock Lavinia had been used to envying her the possession of. It was deep and warm in colour, and beautifully made. Her slender feet looked as they had done when Jessie had admired them, and the hair, whose heavy locks had made her look rather like a Shetland pony when it fell loose about her small, odd face, was tied back with a ribbon. "Perhaps some one has left her a fortune," Jessie whispered. "I always thought something would happen to her. She's so queer." "Perhaps the diamond mines have suddenly appeared again," said Lavinia scathingly. "Don't please her by staring at her in that way, you silly thing." "Sarah," broke in Miss Minchin's deep voice, "come and sit here." And while the whole schoolroom stared and pushed with elbows, and scarcely made any effort to conceal its excited curiosity, Sarah went to her old seat of honour and bent her head over her books. That night, when she went to her room, after she and Becky had eaten their supper, she sat and looked at the fire seriously for a long time. "Are you making something up in your head, miss?" Becky inquired with a respectful softness. When Sarah sat in silence and looked into the coals with dreaming eyes, it generally meant that she was making a new story. But this time she was not, and she shook her head. "No," she answered. "I am wondering what I ought to do." Becky stared, still respectfully. She was filled with something approaching reverence for everything Sarah did and said. "I can't help thinking about my friend," Sarah explained. "If he wants to keep himself a secret, it would be rude to try and find out who he is. But I do so want him to know how thankful I am to him, and how happy he has made me. Any one who is kind wants to know when people have been made happy. They care for that more than for being thanked. I do wish—" She stopped short, because her eyes at that instant fell upon something standing on a table in a corner. It was something she had found in the room when she came up to it only 2 days before. It was a little writing case, fitted with paper and envelopes and pens and ink. "Oh!" she exclaimed. "Why did I not think of that before?" She rose and went to the corner and brought the case back to the fire. "I can write to him," she said joyfully, "and leave it on the table. Then perhaps the person who takes the things away will take it too. I won't ask him anything. He won't mind my thanking him, I feel sure." So she wrote a note. This is what she said. "I hope you will not think it is impolite that I should write this note to you when you wish to keep yourself a secret. Please believe I do not mean to be impolite or try to find out anything at all. Only I want to thank you for being so kind to me, so heavenly kind, and making everything like a fairy story. I am so grateful to you, and I am so happy, and so is Becky. Becky feels just as thankful as I do. It is all just as beautiful and wonderful to her as it is to me. We used to be so lonely and cold and hungry, and now— oh, just think what you have done for us! Please let me say just these words. It seems as if I ought to say them. Thank you, thank you, thank you." The Little Girl in the Attic. The next morning she left this on the little table, and in the evening it had been taken away with the other things, so she knew the magician had received it, and she was happier for the thought. She was reading one of her new books to Becky just before they went to their respective beds, when her attention was attracted by a sound at the skylight. When she looked up from her page, she saw that Becky had heard the sound also, as she had turned her head to look, and was listening rather nervously. "Something's there, miss," she whispered. "Yes," said Sarah slowly. "It sounds rather like a cat trying to get in." She left her chair and went to the skylight. It was a queer little sound she heard, like a soft scratching. She suddenly remembered something and laughed. She remembered a quaint little intruder who had made his way into the attic once before. She had seen him that very afternoon, sitting disconsolately on a table before a window in the Indian gentleman's house. "Suppose," she whispered in pleased excitement, "just suppose it was the monkey who got away again. Oh, I wish it was." She climbed on a chair, very cautiously raised the skylight, and peeped out. It had been snowing all day, and on the snow, quite near her, crouched a tiny, shivering figure, whose small black face wrinkled itself piteously at sight of her. "It is the monkey!" she cried out. "He has crept out of the Lascars' attic, and he saw the light."
Becky ran to her side. "Are you going to let him in, miss?" she said. "Yes," Sarah answered joyfully. "It's too cold for monkeys to be out. They're delicate. I'll coax him in." She put a hand out delicately, speaking in a coaxing voice, as she spoke to the sparrows and to Melchizedek, as if she were some friendly little animal herself. "Come along, monkey darling," she said. "I won't hurt you." He knew she would not hurt him. He knew it before she laid her soft, caressing little paw on him and drew him towards her. He had felt human love in the slim brown hands of Ram Dass, and he felt it in hers. He let her lift him through the skylight, and when he found himself in her arms he cuddled up to her breast and looked up into her face. "Nice monkey, nice monkey," she crooned, kissing his funny head. "Oh, I do love little animal things." He was evidently glad to get to the fire, and when she sat down and held him in her knee he looked from her to Becky with mingled interest and appreciation. "He is plain looking, miss, ain't he?" said Becky. "He looks like a very ugly baby," laughed Sarah. "I beg your pardon, monkey, but I'm glad you are not a baby. Your mother couldn't be proud of you, and no one would dare to say you looked like any of your relations. Oh, I do like you." She leaned back in her chair and reflected. "Perhaps he's sorry he's so ugly," she said, "and it's always on his mind. I wonder if he has a mind. Monkey, my love, have you a mind?" But the monkey only put a tiny paw up and scratched his head. "What shall you do with him?" Becky asked. "I shall let him sleep with me to-night, and then take him back to the Indian gentleman to-morrow. I am sorry to take you back, monkey, but you must go. You ought to be fondest of your own family, and I'm not a real relation." And when she went to bed she made him a nest at her feet, and he curled up and slept there as if he were a baby, and much pleased with his quarters. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17. It is the Child. The next afternoon 3 members of the large family sat in the Indian gentleman's library, doing their best to cheer him up. They had been allowed to come in to perform this office because he had specially invited them. He had been living in a state of suspense for some time, and today he was waiting for a certain event very anxiously. This event was the return of Mr. Carmichael from Moscow. His stay there had been prolonged from week to week. On his first arrival there he had not been able satisfactorily to trace the family he had gone in search of. When he felt at last sure that he had found them and had gone to their house, he had been told that they were absent on a journey. His efforts to reach them had been unavailing, so he had decided to remain in Moscow until their return. Mr. Carrisford sat in his reclining chair, and Janet sat on the floor beside him. He was very fond of Janet. Nora had found a footstool, and Donald was astride the tiger's head which ornamented the rug made of the animal's skin. It must be owned that he was riding it rather violently. "Don't cheer up so loud, Donald," Janet said. "When you come to cheer an ill person up, you don't cheer him up at the top of your voice. Perhaps cheering up is too loud, Mr. Carrisford?" turning to the Indian gentleman. But he only patted her shoulder. "No, it isn't," he answered. "And it keeps me from thinking too much." "I'm going to be quiet," Donald shouted. "We'll all be as quiet as mice." "Mice don't make a noise like that," said Janet. Donald made a bridle of his handkerchief and bounced up and down on the tiger's head. "A whole lot of mice might," he said cheerfully. 1,000 mice might." "I don't believe 50,000 mice would," said Janet severely. "And we have to be as quiet as one mouse." Mr. Carrisford laughed and patted her shoulder again. "Papa won't be very long now," she said. "May we talk about the little lost girl?" "I don't think I could talk much about anything else just now," the Indian gentleman answered, knitting his forehead with a tired look. "We like her so much," said Nora. "We call her the little unfairy princess." "Why?" the Indian gentleman inquired, because the fancies of the large family always made him forget things a little. It was Janet who answered. "It is because, though she is not exactly a fairy, She will be so rich when she is found that she will be like a princess in a fairy tale. We called her the fairy princess at first, but it didn't quite suit." "Is it true," said Norah, "that her papa gave all his money to a friend to put in a mine that had diamonds in it, and then the friend thought he had lost it all, and ran away because he felt as if he was a robber? But he wasn't really, you know," put in Janet hastily. The Indian gentleman took hold of her hand quickly. "No, he wasn't really," he said. "I am sorry for the friend," Janet said. "I can't help it. He didn't mean to do it, and it would break his heart. I am sure it would break his heart." "You are an understanding little woman, Janet," the Indian gentleman said, and he held her hand close. "Did you tell Mr. Carrisford," Donald shouted again, "about the little girl who isn't a beggar? Did you tell him she has new nice clothes? Perhaps she's been found by somebody when she was lost." "There's a cab!" exclaimed Janet. "It's stopping before the door. It is papa." They all ran to the windows to look out. "Yes, it's papa," Donald proclaimed. "But there is no little girl." All three of them incontinently fled from the room and tumbled into the hall. It was in this way they always welcomed their father. They were to be heard jumping up and down, clapping their hands, and being caught up and kissed. Mr. Carrisford made an effort to rise, and sank back again. "It is no use," he said. "What a wreck I am." Mr. Carmichael's voice approached the door. "No, children," he was saying. "You may come in after I have talked to Mr. Carrisford. Go and play with Ram Das." Then the door opened and he came in. He looked rosier than ever, and brought an atmosphere of freshness and health with him. But his eyes were disappointed and anxious as they met the invalid's look of eager question, even as they grasped each other's hands. "What news?" Mr. Carrisford asked. "The child the Russian people adopted?" "She is not the child we were looking for," was Mr. Carmichael's answer. "She is much younger than Captain Crewe's little girl. Her name is Emily Carew. I've seen and talked to her. The Russians were able to give me every detail." How wearied and miserable the Indian gentleman looked. His hand dropped from Mr. Carmichael's. "Then the search has to be begun over again," he said. "That is all. Please sit down." Mr. Carmichael took a seat. Somehow he had gradually grown fond of this unhappy man. He was himself so well and happy, and so surrounded by cheerfulness and love, that desolation and broken health seemed pitifully unbearable things. If there had been the sound of just one gay little high-pitched voice in the house, it would have been so much less forlorn. And that a man should be compelled to carry about in his breast the thought that he had seemed to wrong and desert a child was not a thing one could face. "Come, come," he said in his cheery voice. "We'll find her yet." "We must begin at once. No time must be lost," Mr. Carrisford fretted. "Have you any new suggestion to make? Any whatsoever?" Mr. Carmichael felt rather restless, and he rose and began to pace the room with a thoughtful, though uncertain face. "Well, perhaps," he said. "I don't know what it may be worth. The fact is, an idea occurred to me as I was thinking the thing over in the train on the journey from Dover." "What was it? If she is alive, she is somewhere." "Yes, she is somewhere. We have searched the schools in Paris. Let us give up Paris and begin in London. That was my idea, to search London." "There are schools enough in London," said Mr. Carrisford. Then he slightly started, roused by a recollection. "By the way, there is one next door." "Then we will begin there. We cannot begin nearer than next door." "No," said Carrisford. "There is a child there who interests me, but she is not a pupil. And she is a little dark, forlorn creature, as unlike poor Crewe as a child could be." Perhaps the magic was at work again at that very moment, the beautiful magic. It really seemed as if it might be so. What was it that brought Ram Das into the room, even as his master spoke, salaaming respectfully, but with a scarcely concealed touch of excitement in his dark, flashing eyes? "Sahib," he said, "the child herself has come, the child the Sahib felt pity for. She brings back the monkey, who had again run away to her attic under the roof.
I have asked that she remain. It was my thought that it would please the Sahib to see and speak with her." "Who is she?" inquired Mr. Carmichael. "God knows," Mr. Carrisford answered. "She is the child I spoke of, a little drudge at the school." He waved his hand to Ram Das and addressed him. "Yes, I should like to see her. Go and bring her in." Then he turned to Mr. Carmichael. "While you have been away," he explained, "I have been desperate. The days were so dark and long. Ram Das told me of this child's miseries, and together we invented a romantic plan to help her. I suppose it was a childish thing to do, but it gave me something to plan and think of. Without the help of an agile, soft-footed Oriental like Ram Das, however, it could not have been done." Then Sarah came into the room. She carried the monkey in her arms, and he evidently did not intend to part from her, if it could be helped. He was clinging to her and chattering, and the interesting excitement of finding herself in the Indian gentleman's room had brought a flush to Sarah's cheeks. "Your monkey ran away again," she said in her pretty voice. "He came to my garret window last night, and I took him in because it was so cold. I would have brought him back if it had not been so late. I knew you were ill, and might not like to be disturbed." The Indian gentleman's hollow eyes dwelt on her with curious interest. "That was very thoughtful of you," he said. Sarah looked toward Ram Das, who stood near the door. "Shall I give him to the Lascar?" she asked. "How do you know that he is a Lascar?" said the Indian gentleman, smiling a little. "Oh, I know Lascars," Sarah said, handing over the reluctant monkey. "I was born in India." The Indian gentleman sat upright so suddenly and with such a change of expression that she was for a moment quite startled. "You were born in India?" he exclaimed. "Were you? Come here." And he held out his hand. Sarah went to him and laid her hand in his, as he seemed to want to take it. She stood still, and her green-grey eyes met his wonderingly. Something seemed to be the matter with him. "You live next door?" he demanded. "Yes, I live at Miss Minchin's seminary." "But you are not one of her pupils?" A strange little smile hovered about Sarah's mouth. She hesitated a moment. "I don't think I know exactly what I am," she replied. "Why not?" "At first I was a pupil and a parlour boarder, but now—" "You were a pupil? What are you now?" The queer little sad smile was on Sarah's lips again. "I sleep in the attic next to the scullery maid," she said. "I run errands for the cook. I do anything she tells me, and I teach the little ones their lessons." "Question her, Carmichael," said Mr. Carrisford, sinking back as if he had lost his strength. "Question her. I cannot." The big, kind father of the large family knew how to question little girls. Sarah realised how much practice he had had when he spoke to her in his nice, encouraging voice. "What do you mean by at first, my child?" he inquired. "When I was first taken there by my papa." "Where is your papa?" "He died," said Sarah very quietly. "He lost all his money, and there was none left for me. There is no one to take care of me or to pay Miss Minchin." "Carmichael!" the Indian gentleman cried out loudly. "Carmichael!" "We must not frighten her," Mr. Carmichael said aside to him in a quick, low voice. And he added aloud to Sarah, "So you were sent up into the attic and made into a little drudge. That was about it, wasn't it?" "There was no one to take care of me," said Sarah. "There was no money. I belonged to nobody." "How did your father lose his money?" the Indian gentleman broke in breathlessly. "He did not lose it himself," Sarah answered, wondering still more each moment. "He had a friend he was very fond of. He was very fond of him. It was his friend who took his money. He trusted his friend too much." The Indian gentleman's breath came more quickly. "The friend might have meant to do no harm," he said. "It might have happened through a mistake." Sarah did not know how unrelenting her quiet young voice sounded as she answered. If she had known, she would surely have tried to soften it for the Indian gentleman's sake.
The suffering was just as bad for my papa, she said. It killed him.
What was your father's name? The Indian gentleman said. Tell me.
His name was Ralph Crewe, Sarah answered, feeling startled. Captain Crewe. He died in India. The haggard face contracted, and Ram Das sprang to his master's side.
Carmichael, the invalid gasped. It is the child! The child!
For a moment Sarah thought he was going to die. Ram Das poured out drops from a bottle and held them to his lips. Sarah stood near, trembling a little. She looked in a bewildered way at Mr. Carmichael. "What child am I?" she faltered.
He was your father's friend, Mr. Carmichael answered her. Don't be frightened. We've been looking for you for 2 years.
Sarah put her hand up to her forehead, and her mouth trembled. She spoke as if she were in a dream. "And I was at Miss Minchin's all the while," she half whispered, "just on the other side of the wall." End of chapter 17. Chapter 18. I Tried Not to Be. It was pretty, comfortable Mrs. Carmichael who explained everything. She was sent for at once, and came across the square to take Sarah into her warm arms and make clear to her all that had happened. The excitement of the totally unexpected discovery had been temporarily almost overpowering to Mr. Carrisford in his weak condition.
"Upon my word,"
he said faintly to Mr. Carmichael, when it was suggested that the little girl should go into another room.
"I feel as if I do not want to lose sight of her."
"I will take care of her," Janet said, "and mamma will come in a few minutes." And it was Janet who led her away. "We're so glad you were found," she said. "You don't know how glad we are that you were found." Donald stood with his hands in his pockets and gazed at Sarah with reflecting and self-reproachful eyes. "If I'd just asked what your name was when I gave you my sixpence," he said, "you would have told me it was Sarah Crewe, and then you would have been found in a minute." Then Mrs. Carmichael came in. She looked very much moved, and suddenly took Sarah in her arms and kissed her. "You look bewildered, poor child," she said, "and it is not to be wondered at." Sarah could only think of one thing. "Was he," she said, with a glance toward the closed door of the library, "was he the wicked friend? Oh, do tell me." Mrs. Carmichael was crying as she kissed her again. She felt as if she ought to be kissed very often, because she had not been kissed for so long. "He was not wicked, my dear," she answered. "He did not really lose your papa's money. He only thought he had lost it, and because he loved him so much, his grief made him so ill that for a time he was not in his right mind. He almost died of brain fever, and long before he began to recover, your poor papa was dead." "And he did not know where to find me," murmured Sarah. "And I was so near." Somehow she could not forget that she had been so near. "He believed you were in school in France," Mrs. Carmichael explained, "and he was continually misled by false clues. He has looked for you everywhere. When he saw you pass by, looking so sad and neglected, he did not dream that you were his friend's poor child. But because you were a little girl too, he was sorry for you, and he wanted to make you happier. And he told Ram Das to climb into your attic window and try to make you comfortable." Sarah gave a start of joy. Her whole look changed. "Did Ram Das bring the things?" she cried out. "Did he tell Ram Das to do it? Did he make the dream that came true?" "Yes, my dear, yes. He is kind and good, and he was sorry for you, for little lost Sarah Crewe's sake." The library door opened, and Mr. Carmichael appeared, calling Sarah to him with a gesture.
"Mr. Carrisford is better already," he said. "He wants you to come to him."
Sarah did not wait. When the Indian gentleman looked at her as she entered, he saw that her face was all alight. She went and stood before his chair, with her hands clasped together against her breast. "You sent the things to me," she said in a joyful, emotional little voice. "The beautiful, beautiful things? You sent them."
"Yes, poor dear child, I did," he answered her.
He was weak and broken with long illness and trouble, but he looked at her with the look she remembered in her father's eyes, that look of loving her and wanting to take her in his arms. It made her kneel down by him, just as she used to kneel by her father when they were the dearest friends and lovers in the world. "Then it is you who are my friend," she said. "It is you who are my friend." And she dropped her face on his thin hand and kissed it again and again. "The man will be himself again in 3 weeks," Mr. Carmichael said aside to his wife. "Look at his face already." In fact, he did look changed. Here was the little missus, and he had new things to think of and plan for already. In the first place, there was Miss Minchin. She must be interviewed and told of the change which had taken place in the fortunes of her pupil. Sarah was not to return to the seminary at all. The Indian gentleman was very determined upon that point. She must remain where she was, and Mr. Carmichael should go and see Miss Minchin himself. "I am glad I need not go back," said Sarah. "She will be very angry. She does not like me, though perhaps it is my fault, because I do not like her." But, oddly enough, Miss Minchin made it unnecessary for Mr. Carmichael to go to her by actually coming in search of her pupil herself. She had wanted Sarah for something, and on inquiry had heard an astonishing thing. One of the housemaids had seen her steal out of the area with something hidden under her cloak, and had also seen her go up the steps of the next door and enter the house.
"What does she mean?" cried Miss Minchin to Miss Amelia.
"I don't know, I'm sure, sister," answered Miss Amelia,
"unless she has made friends with him because he has lived in India." "It would be just like her to thrust herself upon him and try to gain his sympathies in some such impertinent fashion," said Miss Minchin. "She must have been in the house for 2 hours. I will not allow such presumption. I shall go and inquire into the matter and apologise for her intrusion."
Sarah was sitting on a footstool close to Mr. Carrisford's knee, and listening to some of the many things he felt it necessary to try to explain to her, when Ram Das announced the visitor's arrival. Sarah rose involuntarily and became rather pale, but Mr. Carrisford saw that she stood quietly and showed none of the ordinary signs of child terror. Miss Minchin entered the room with a sternly dignified manner. She was correctly and well dressed, and rigidly polite. "I am sorry to disturb Mr. Carrisford," she said, "but I have explanations to make. I am Miss Minchin, the proprietress of the young ladies' seminary next door." The Indian gentleman looked at her for a moment, in silent scrutiny. He was a man who had naturally a rather hot temper, and he did not wish it to get too much the better of him.
"So you are Miss Minchin?" he said. "I am, sir." "In that case," the Indian gentleman replied, "you have arrived at the right time. My solicitor, Mr. Carmichael, was just on the point of going to see you."
Mr. Carmichael bowed slightly, and Miss Minchin looked from him to Mr. Carrisford in amazement.
"Your solicitor?" she said. "I do not understand. I have come here as a matter of duty. I have just discovered that you have been intruded upon through the forwardness of one of my pupils, a charity pupil. I came to explain that she intruded without my knowledge."
She turned upon Sarah.
"Go home at once," she commanded indignantly. "You shall be severely punished. Go home at once."
The Indian gentleman drew Sarah to his side and patted her hand.
"She is not going."
Miss Minchin felt as if she must be losing her senses.
"Not going?"
she repeated.
"No," said Mr. Carrisford. "She is not going home, if you give your house that name. Her home for the future will be with me."
Miss Minchin fell back in amazed indignation.
"With you? With you, sir? What does this mean?" "Kindly explain the matter, Carmichael," said the Indian gentleman, "and get it over as quickly as possible."
And he made Sarah sit down again and held her hands in his, which was another trick of her papa's. Then Mr. Carmichael explained, in his quiet, level-toned, steady manner of a man who knew his subject and all its legal significance, which was a thing Miss Minchin understood as a business woman and did not enjoy.
"Mr. Carrisford, madam," he said, "was an intimate friend of the late Captain Crewe. He was his partner in certain large investments. The fortune which Captain Crewe supposed he had lost has been recovered, and is now in Mr. Carrisford's hands." "The fortune?" cried Miss Minchin, and she really lost colour as she uttered the exclamation. "Sarah's fortune?" "It will be Sarah's fortune," replied Mr. Carmichael rather coldly. "It is Sarah's fortune now, in fact. Certain events have increased it enormously. The diamond mines have retrieved themselves." "The diamond mines?" Miss Minchin gasped out. If this was true, nothing so horrible, she felt, had ever happened to her since she was born. "The diamond mines," Mr. Carmichael repeated, and he could not help adding, with a rather sly, unlawyer-like smile, "There are not many princesses, Miss Minchin, who are richer than your little charity pupil Sarah Crewe will be. Mr. Carrisford has been searching for her for nearly 2 years. He has found her at last, and he will keep her." After which he asked Miss Minchin to sit down while he explained matters to her fully, and went into such detail as was necessary to make it quite clear to her that Sarah's future was an assured one, and that what had seemed to be lost was to be restored to her tenfold. Also that she had in Mr. Carrisford a guardian as well as a friend. Miss Minchin was not a clever woman, and in her excitement she was silly enough to make one desperate effort to regain what she could not help seeing she had lost through her worldly folly. "He found her under my care," she protested. "I have done everything for her. But for me she should have starved in the streets." Here the Indian gentleman lost his temper. "As to starving in the streets," he said, "she might have starved more comfortably there than in your attic." "Captain Crewe left her in my charge," Miss Minchin argued. "She must return to it until she is of age. She can be a parlour boarder again. She must finish her education. The law will interfere in my behalf." "Come, come, Miss Minchin," Mr. Carmichael interposed. "The law will do nothing of the sort. If Sarah herself wishes to return to you, I dare say Mr. Carrisford might not refuse to allow it. But that rests with Sarah." "Then," said Miss Minchin, "I appeal to Sarah. I have not spoiled you, perhaps," she said awkwardly to the little girl. "But you know that your papa was pleased with your progress. And I have always been fond of you." Sarah's grey-green eyes fixed themselves on her with the quiet, clear look Miss Minchin particularly disliked. "Have you, Miss Minchin?" she said. "I did not know that." Miss Minchin reddened and drew herself up. "You ought to have known it," said she. "But children, unfortunately, never know what is best for them. Amelia and I always said you were the cleverest child in the school. Will you not do your duty to your poor papa and come home with me?" Sarah took a step toward her and stood still. She was thinking of the day when she had been told that she belonged to nobody and was in danger of being turned into the street. She was thinking of the cold, hungry hours she had spent alone with Emily and Melchizedek in the attic. She looked Miss Minchin steadily in the face. "You know why I will not go home with you, Miss Minchin," she said. "You know quite well." A hot flush showed itself on Miss Minchin's hard, angry face. "You will never see your companions again," she began. "I will see that Ermengarde and Lottie are kept away." Mr. Carmichael stopped her with polite firmness. "Excuse me," he said. "She will see any one she wishes to see. The parents of Miss Crewe's fellow pupils are not likely to refuse her invitations to visit her at her guardian's house. Mr. Carrisford will attend to that." It must be confessed that even Miss Minchin flinched. This was worse than the eccentric bachelor uncle who might have a peppery temper and be easily offended at the treatment of his niece. A woman of sordid mind could easily believe that most people would not refuse to allow their children to remain friends with a little heiress of diamond mines. And if Mr. Carrisford chose to tell certain of her patrons how unhappy Sarah Crewe had been made, many unpleasant things might happen. "You have not undertaken an easy charge," she said to the Indian gentleman as she turned to leave the room. "You will discover that very soon. The child is neither truthful nor grateful. I suppose," to Sarah, "that you feel now that you are a princess again." Sarah looked down and flushed a little,
because she thought her pet fancy might not be easy for strangers, even nice ones, to understand at first. "I tried not to be anything else," she answered in a low voice. "Even when I was coldest and hungriest, I tried not to be."
"Now it will not be necessary to try," said Miss Minchin acidly, as Ram Dass salaamed her out of the room. She returned home and, going to her sitting-room, sent at once for Miss Amelia. She sat closeted with her all the rest of the afternoon, and it must be admitted that poor Miss Amelia passed through more than one bad quarter of an hour. She shed a good many tears and mopped her eyes a good deal. One of her unfortunate remarks almost caused her sister to snap her head entirely off, but it resulted in an unusual manner.
"I am not as clever as you, sister," she said, "and I am always afraid to say things to you for fear of making you angry. Perhaps if I were not so timid it would be better for the school and for both of us. I must say I've often thought it would have been better if you had been less severe on Sarah Crewe and had seen that she was decently dressed and more comfortable. I know she was worked too hard for a child of her age, and I know she was only half fed."
"How dare you say such a thing!" exclaimed Miss Minchin.
"I don't know how I dare," Miss Amelia answered with a kind of reckless courage. "But now I've begun I may as well finish, whatever happens to me. The child was a clever child and a good child, and she would have paid you for any kindness you had showed her. But you didn't show her any. The fact was, she was too clever for you, and you always disliked her for that reason. She used to see through us both."
"Amelia!"
gasped her infuriated elder, looking as if she would box her ears and knock her cap off, as she had often done to Becky. But Miss Amelia's disappointment had made her hysterical enough not to care what occurred next. "She did! She did!" she cried. "She saw through us both. She saw that you were a hard-hearted, worldly woman, and that I was a weak fool, and that we were both of us vulgar and mean enough to grovel our knees for her money, and behave ill to her because it was taken from her, though she behaved herself like a little princess, even when she was a beggar. She did, like a little princess." And her hysterics got the better of the poor woman, and she began to laugh and cry both at once, and rock herself backward and forward. "And now you've lost her!" she cried wildly. "And some other school will get her and her money, and if she were like any other child she'd tell how she's been treated, and all our pupils would be taken away, and we should be ruined. And it serves us right. But it serves you right more than it does me, for you are a hard woman, Maria Minchin. You're a hard, selfish, worldly woman." And she was in danger of making so much noise with her hysterical chokes and gurgles that her sister was obliged to go to her and apply salts and sal volatile to quiet her, instead of pouring forth her indignation at her audacity. And from that time forward, it may be mentioned, the elder Miss Minchin actually began to stand a little in awe of a sister who, while she looked so foolish, was evidently not quite so foolish as she looked, and might consequently break out and speak truths people did not want to hear. That evening, when the pupils were gathered together before the fire in the schoolroom, as was their custom before going to bed, Ermengarde came in with a letter in her hand and a queer expression on her round face. It was queer because, while it was an expression of delighted excitement, it was combined with such amazement as seemed to belong to a kind of shock just received. "What is the matter?" cried 2 or 3 voices at once. "Is it anything to do with the row that has been going on?" said Lavinia eagerly. "There has been such a row in Miss Minchin's room. Miss Amelia has had something like hysterics, and has had to go to bed." Ermengarde answered them slowly, as if she were half stunned. "I have just had this letter from Sarah," she said, holding it out to let them see what a long letter it was. "From Sarah?" Every voice joined in that exclamation. "Where is she?" almost shrieked Jessie. "Next door," said Ermengarde, "with the Indian gentleman." "Where? Where? Has she been sent away? Does Miss Minchin know? Was the row about that? Why did she write? Tell us, tell us!" There was a perfect babel, and Lottie began to cry plaintively. Ermengarde answered them slowly, as if she were half plunged out into what, at the moment, seemed the most important and self-explaining thing. "There were diamond mines," she said stoutly. "There were."
Open mouths and open eyes confronted her.
"They were real," she hurried on. "It was all a mistake about them. Something happened for a time, and Mr. Carrisford thought they were ruined."
"Who is Mr. Carrisford?" shouted Jessie.
"The Indian gentleman. And Captain Crewe thought so too, and he died, and Mr. Carrisford had brain fever and ran away, and he almost died, and he did not know where Sarah was. And it turned out that there were millions and millions of diamonds in the mines, and half of them belonged to Sarah, and they belonged to her when she was living in the attic with no one but Melchizedek for a friend, and the cook ordering her about. And Mr. Carrisford found her this afternoon, and he has got her in his home, and she will never come back, and she will be more a princess than she ever was, 150,000 times more. And I am going to see her to-morrow afternoon. There!"
Even Miss Minchin herself could scarcely have controlled the uproar after this, and though she heard the noise, she did not try. She was not in the mood to face anything more than she was facing in her room, while Miss Amelia was weeping in bed. She knew that the news had penetrated the walls in some mysterious manner, and that every servant and every child would go to bed talking about it. So until almost midnight the entire seminary, realizing somehow that all rules were laid aside, crowded round Ermengarde in the schoolroom, and heard read and re-read the letter containing a story which was quite as wonderful as any Sarah herself had ever invented, and which had the amazing charm of having happened to Sarah herself, and the mystic Indian gentleman in the very next house. Becky, who had heard it also, managed to creep upstairs earlier than usual. She wanted to get away from people and go and look at the little magic room once more. She did not know what would happen to it. It was not likely that it would be left to Miss Minchin. It would be taken away, and the attic would be bare and empty again. Glad as she was for Sarah's sake, she went up the last flight of stairs with a lump in her throat and tears blurring her sight. There would be no fire to-night, and no rosy lamp, no supper, and no princess sitting in the glow reading or telling stories. No princess. She choked down a sob as she pushed the attic door open, and then she broke into a low cry. The lamp was flushing the room, the fire was blazing, the supper was waiting, and Ram Dass was standing smiling into her startled face. "Missy Sahib remembered," he said. "She told the Sahib all. She wished you to know the good fortune which has befallen her. Behold a letter on the tray. She has written. She did not wish that you should go to sleep unhappy. The Sahib commands you to come to him to-morrow. You are to be the attendant of Missy Sahib. Tonight I take these things back over the roof." And having said this with a beaming face, he made a little salaam and slipped through the skylight with an agile silentness of movement which showed Becky how easily he had done it before. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19. Anne. Never had such joy reigned in the nursery of the Large Family. Never had they dreamed of such delights as resulted from an intimate acquaintance with the little girl who was not a beggar. The mere fact of her sufferings and adventures made her a priceless possession. Everybody wanted to be told over and over again the things which had happened to her. When one was sitting by a warm fire in a big, glowing room, it was quite delightful to hear how cold it could be in an attic. It must be admitted that the attic was rather delighted in, and that its coldness and bareness quite sank into insignificance when Melchizedek was remembered, and one heard about the sparrows and things one could see if one climbed on the table and stuck one's head and shoulders out of the skylight. Of course the thing loved best was the story of the banquet and the dream which was true. Sarah told it for the first time the day after she had been found. Several members of the Large Family came to take tea with her, and as they sat or curled up on the hearthrug she told the story in her own way, and the Indian gentleman listened and watched her. When she had finished she looked up at him and put her hand on his knee. "That is my part," she said. "Now won't you tell your part of it, Uncle Tom?" He had asked her to call him always Uncle Tom. "I don't know your part yet, and it must be beautiful." So he told them how, when he sat alone, ill and dull and irritable,
Ram Dass had tried to distract him by describing the passers-by, and there was one child who passed oftener than any one else. He had begun to be interested in her, partly perhaps because he was thinking a great deal of a little girl, and partly because Ram Dass had been able to relate the incident of his visit to the attic in chase of the monkey. He had described its cheerless look, and the bearing of the child, who seemed as if she was not of the class of those who were treated as drudges and servants. Bit by bit, Ram Dass had made discoveries concerning the wretchedness of her life. He had found out how easy a matter it was to climb across the few yards of roof to the skylight, and this fact had been the beginning of all that followed. "Sahib," he had said one day, "I could cross the slates and make the child a fire when she is out on some errand. When she returned, wet and cold, to find it blazing, she would think a magician had done it." The idea had been so fanciful that Mr. Carrisford's sad face had lighted with a smile, and Ram Dass had been so filled with rapture that he had enlarged upon it and explained to his master how simple it would be to accomplish numbers of other things. He had shown a childlike pleasure and invention, and the preparations for the carrying out of the plan had filled many a day with interest, which would otherwise have dragged wearily. On the night of the frustrated banquet, Ram Dass had kept watch, all his packages being in readiness in the attic which was his own, and the person who was to help him had waited with him, as interested as himself in the odd adventure. Ram Dass had been lying flat upon the slates, looking in at the skylight, when the banquet had come to its disastrous conclusion. He had been sure of the profoundness of Sarah's wearied sleep, and then, with a dark lantern, he had crept into the room, while his companion remained outside and handed the things to him. When Sarah had stirred ever so faintly, Ram Dass had closed the lantern slide and lain flat upon the floor. These and many other exciting things the children found out by asking 1,000 questions. "I am so glad," Sarah said. "I am so glad it was you who are my friend." There never were such friends as these two became. Somehow they seemed to suit each other in a wonderful way. The Indian gentleman had never had a companion he liked quite as much as he liked Sarah. In a month's time he was, as Mr. Carmichael had prophesied he would be, a new man. He was always amused and interested, and he began to find an actual pleasure in the possession of the wealth he had imagined that he loathed the burden of. There were so many charming things to plan for Sarah. There was a little joke between them that he was a magician, and it was one of his pleasures to invent things to surprise her. She found beautiful new flowers growing in her room, whimsical little gifts tucked under pillows, and once, as they sat together in the evening, they heard the scratch of a heavy paw on the door, and when Sarah went to find out what it was, there stood a great dog, a splendid Russian boarhound, with a grand silver and gold collar bearing an inscription. "I am Boris," it read. "I serve the Princess Sarah." There was nothing the Indian gentleman loved more than the recollection of the little princess in rags and tatters. The afternoons in which the large family, or Ermengarde and Lottie, gathered to rejoice together were very delightful. But the hours when Sarah and the Indian gentleman sat alone and read or talked had a special charm of their own. During their passing many interesting things occurred. One evening Mr. Carrisford, looking up from his book, noticed that his companion had not stirred for some time, but sat gazing into the fire. "What are you supposing, Sarah?" he asked. Sarah looked up, with a bright colour on her cheek. "I was supposing," she said. "I was remembering that hungry day, and a child I saw." "But there were a great many hungry days," said the Indian gentleman, with rather a sad tone in his voice. "Which hungry day was it?" "I forgot you didn't know," said Sarah. "It was the day the dream came true." Then she told him the story of the bun shop, and the fourpence she picked up out of the sloppy mud, and the child who was hungrier than herself. She told it quite simply, and in as few words as possible. But somehow the Indian gentleman found it necessary to shade his eyes with his hand and look down at the carpet. "And I was supposing a kind of plan," she said when she had finished. "I was thinking I should like to do something."
"What was it?" said Mr. Carrisford in a low tone. "You may do anything you like to do, Princess."
"I was wondering," rather hesitated Sarah. "You know, you say I have so much money. I was wondering if I could go see the bun woman and tell her that if, when hungry children, particularly on those dreadful days, come and sit on the steps or look in at the window, she would just call them in and give them something to eat. She might send the bills to me. Could I do that?"
"You shall do it to-morrow morning," said the Indian gentleman.
"Thank you," said Sarah. "You see, I know what it is to be hungry, and it is very hard when one cannot even pretend it away."
"Yes, yes, my dear," said the Indian gentleman. "Yes, yes, it must be. Try to forget it. Come and sit on this footstool near my knee, and only remember you are a princess."
"Yes," said Sarah, smiling, "and I can give buns and bread to the populace." And she went and sat on the stool, and the Indian gentleman, he used to like her to call him that too sometimes, drew her small dark head down on his knee and stroked her hair. The next morning Miss Minchin, in looking out of her window, saw the things she perhaps least enjoyed seeing. The Indian gentleman's carriage with its tall horses drew up before the door of the next house, and its owner and a little figure, warm with soft rich furs, descended the steps to get into it. The little figure was a familiar one, and reminded Miss Minchin of days in the past. It was followed by another as familiar, the sight of which she found very irritating. It was Becky, who, in the character of delighted attendant, always accompanied her young mistress to her carriage, carrying wraps and belongings. Already Becky had a pink, round face. A little later the carriage drew up before the door of the baker's shop, and its occupants got out, oddly enough, just as the bun woman was putting a tray of smoking hot buns into the window. When Sarah entered the shop, the woman turned and looked at her, and, leaving the buns, came and stood behind the counter. For a moment she looked at Sarah very hard indeed, and then her good-natured face lighted up. "I'm sure that I remember you, miss," she said. "And yet—" "Yes," said Sarah. "Once you gave me 6 buns for 4pence, and you gave 5 of them to a beggar child," the woman broke in on her. "I've always remembered it. I couldn't make it out at first." She turned round to the Indian gentleman and spoke her next words to him. "I beg your pardon, sir, but there's not many young people that notices a hungry face in that way, and have thought of it many a time. Excuse the liberty, miss," to Sarah, "but you look rosier and, well, better than you did that. "I am better, thank you," said Sarah. "And I am much happier, and I have come to ask you to do something for me." "Me, miss?" exclaimed the bun woman, smiling cheerfully. "Why, bless you! Yes, miss, what can I do?" And then Sarah, leaning on the counter, made her little proposal concerning the dreadful days and the hungry waifs and the buns. The woman watched her and listened with an astonished face. "Why, bless me," she said again when she had heard it all. "It'll be a pleasure to me to do it. I am a working woman myself and cannot afford to do much on my own account, and there's sights of trouble on every side. But if you'll excuse me, I'm bound to say I've given away many a bit of bread since that wet afternoon, just along of thinking of you, and how wet and cold you was, and how hungry you looked, and yet you gave away your hot buns as if you was a princess." The Indian gentleman smiled involuntarily at this, and Sarah smiled a little too, remembering what she had said to herself when she put the buns down on the ravenous child's ragged lap. "She looked so hungry," she said. "She was even hungrier than I was." "She was starving," said the woman. "Many's the time she's told me of it since, how she sat there in the wet and felt as if a wolf was a-tearing at her poor young insides." "Oh, have you seen her since then?" exclaimed Sarah. "Do you know where she is?" "Yes, I do," answered the woman, smiling more good-naturedly than ever. "Why, she's in that there back room, miss, and has been for a month, and a decent, well-meaning girl she's going to turn out, and such a help to me in the shop and in the kitchen as you'd scarce believe, knowing how she's lived." She stepped to the door of the little back parlour and spoke, and the next minute a girl came out and followed her behind the counter. And actually it was the beggar child, clean and neatly clothed, and looking as if she had not been hungry for a long time. She looked shy, but she had a nice face, now that she was no longer a savage, and the wild look had gone from her eyes. She knew Sarah in an instant, and stood and looked at her as if she could never look enough. "You see," said the woman, "I told her to come when she was hungry, and when she'd come I'd give her odd jobs to do, and I found she was willing, and somehow I got to like her, and the end of it was, I've given her a place and a home, and she helps me, and behaves well, and is as thankful as a girl can be. Her name's Anne. She has no other." The children stood and looked at each other for a few minutes, and then Sarah took her hand out of her muff and held it out across the counter, and Anne took it, and they looked straight into each other's eyes. "I am so glad," Sarah said. "And I have just thought of something. Perhaps Mrs. Brown will let you be the one to give the buns and bread to the children. Perhaps you would like to do it, because you know what it is to be hungry too." "Yes, miss," said the girl. And somehow Sarah felt as if she understood her, though she said so little, and only stood still and looked after her, as she went out of the shop with the Indian gentleman, and they got into the carriage and drove away. End of chapter 19. End of A Little Princess by Frances Hodgson Burnett. Recorded by Elizabeth Klett.